During the 18th century, Georgia experienced a dramatic rise and fall. Hopes for political unity and independence appeared stronger than ever. Yet these ambitions were repeatedly crushed by devastating invasions from Ottoman and Iranian forces. By the end of the century, even the long-standing Bagratid royal line would disappear under the growing authority of the Russian Empire. The story of this period is one of reform and cultural revival, but also betrayal, warfare, and constant foreign pressure. At the beginning of the century, the Kingdom of Kartli faced a crisis of leadership. Its rulers were often absent, serving in distant wars for the Persian Shah. King Georgi XI was killed in 1709 while leading Iranian forces in Afghanistan, and his nephew Kai Khosrow died on the same front 2 years later. Power in Kartli therefore fell largely to Vakht Tang, who governed from 1703 and formally became king in 1711. His rule was frequently interrupted by political pressures, rival regents, and his own detention in Iran. During these years, his brothers and later his son governed in his absence, while he remained dependent on the Persian court. Despite these challenges, Vakht Tang reshaped Kartli's internal structure. He introduced a new legal code that regulated social hierarchy with remarkable precision, assigning different penalties for crimes according to social rank. The system reinforced the existing order while also bringing greater legal clarity. Conditions for peasants gradually improved, and restrictions on movement became less severe. Refugees who settled on royal land could eventually gain ownership, and policies were introduced to encourage displaced villagers to return home. These reforms reduced the number of peasants fleeing to neighbouring regions or converting to Islam simply to escape taxation. Vakht Tang also strengthened royal authority and reorganised the economy. Urban centres became property of the crown, and the mint was brought under royal control, even though coin inscriptions still reflected Persian influence. Certain industries, including silk production and textile dyeing, were turned into royal monopolies managed by the king and his Circassian queen. Agriculture revived through improved irrigation systems and expanded grain production. Wheat, barley, and oats were cultivated in increasing quantities, and flax production grew in fertile valleys. Livestock breeding also expanded, particularly pigs, which were less vulnerable to raids from Muslim groups in the Northern Highlands. Wine production flourished to such an extent that additional labourers had to be imported. Around the capital, abandoned lands were transformed with cultivated gardens and flowering plants, symbolising a broader recovery of the landscape. Trade and urban life also began to recover. By the middle of the century, Tbilisi had developed into an active commercial centre filled with shops and workshops. Protective tariffs shielded local markets from foreign competition, while customs revenues financed the construction of roads and caravanserais to encourage international trade. Georgian merchants formed cooperative associations and established trading connections with distant cities such as Astrakhan and Tabriz. Mining and metallurgy expanded as well, with copper and iron production increasing under the supervision of skilled foreign craftsmen. Religious and cultural life underwent transformation alongside economic reforms. Vakht Tang supported the Orthodox Church and strengthened its connection with the monarchy. A major church assembly confirmed his brother as head of the Georgian Church, reinforcing royal influence over religious affairs. The church became closely tied to state authority, and new military units loyal to the crown helped secure the kingdom's northern borders. These forces successfully suppressed uprisings among mountain peoples and reasserted control over frontier regions. Georgia's cultural connections with Europe also grew during this period. Members of the royal family developed close ties with the Russian court, and intellectual exchange increased. new printing technologies were introduced and Georgian texts began to appear in printed form. Religious works, literary classics, and translations were produced, marking a major step in cultural development. A printing press was established in Tbilisi, and despite resistance from conservative clergy, dozens of books were published within a short time. These achievements signaled Georgia's gradual movement toward greater cultural engagement with the wider world. Yet political instability constantly threatened these advances. In 1714, the Persian Shah summoned Vakhtang to Iran and detained him after he refused to convert to Islam. During his absence, rival rulers governed Kartli, and the king attempted to secure international support for his release. A Georgian envoy travelled through Europe seeking assistance from Western powers, even suggesting that the Georgian church might accept papal authority in exchange for political aid. These efforts failed as European rulers prioritized their own diplomatic and commercial interests. Eventually, Vakhtang accepted Islam to regain his position, though his authority remained fragile. Meanwhile, regional conflicts intensified. Neighbouring territories suffered from raids by northern tribes, and alliances between Georgian rulers frequently collapsed. Joint military campaigns against these raiders sometimes succeeded, but political rivalries often undermined cooperation. At the same time, Vakhtang's growing power alarmed the Persian court, which feared he might expand his authority beyond acceptable limits. Seeking a stronger protector, Vakhtang turned to Russia. He believed that the declining Persian state created an opportunity for Russian intervention in the Caucasus. Secret negotiations led to plans for a joint campaign, with Georgian forces prepared to assist a Russian advance along the Caspian coast. Georgian nobles cautiously supported this strategy, hoping Russian military presence would secure their independence. The plan failed. Although Russian forces initially advanced, logistical difficulties and political concerns forced their withdrawal. Vakhtang found himself isolated, having angered both Persia and the Ottoman Empire. Regional enemies seized the opportunity to attack, and after months of conflict, he suffered a decisive defeat. Foreign troops occupied key strongholds and widespread violence devastated the countryside. Villages were destroyed, civilians were massacred, and the kingdom descended into chaos. Ottoman forces soon occupied Tbilisi, and Vakhtang was forced into exile. Despite desperate attempts to regain power, he ultimately abdicated and sought refuge in Russia, accompanied by his family and loyal followers. From abroad, he continued to write and reflect on Georgia's future, hoping that the community of Georgian exiles might one day help restore their homeland. Under Ottoman rule, the country was subjected to heavy taxation and strict administration. Detailed registers recorded every taxable activity, from agriculture and trade to minor household production. Although these policies generated substantial revenue, most of it supported the occupying administration, leaving the population impoverished. Resistance was harshly punished, and many members of the nobility abandoned the country. A sense of despair spread among the people, who felt trapped between rival empires. Western Georgia experienced similar turmoil. Regional rulers competed for power through shifting alliances, betrayals, and constant warfare. Slave trading expanded, local economies collapsed, and political authority changed hands repeatedly. External powers manipulated local disputes, installing and removing rulers to serve their own interests. Periods of brief stability were repeatedly followed by renewed violence, assassinations, and foreign intervention. Throughout these struggles, many Georgian leaders placed their hopes in Russian support. The expansion of Russian military power along the Black Sea raised expectations that Georgia might become a protected ally. Yet these expectations were repeatedly disappointed, leaving the region vulnerable to Ottoman domination. By the early 18th century, Western Georgia had been ravaged by invasions, internal conflicts, and economic decline. Despite the devastation, the period also produced figures who attempted reform and modernization. Some rulers introduced educational initiatives, opened schools, and sought to strengthen state institutions. Yet these efforts were overshadowed by continuous warfare and political fragmentation. The population longed for stable and legitimate leadership, but such stability remained elusive. In Western Georgia, power did not rest in one set of hands at the start. Bejan Dadiani stood as the dominant figure across the region. Ottoman troops held Kutaisi, and King Alexandre V controlled little beyond the income from his own crown lands. Bejan tried to curb the worst excesses of slave trading, and he reinforced his influence by linking his family to the throne, marrying his daughter, Mariam, to Alexandre. The king, short of money and short of leverage, depended on financial support from Vakhtang in Kartli, and tried to keep restless nobles loyal by handing out castles and estates. Over time, the giveaways became a trap. Once there was nothing left to grant, the same magnates he had purchased began to press him harder. Inside this tense court, intrigue never stopped. Alexandre's stepmother, Taima of Guria, travelled with the bishop of Shkondidi to Akaltsike to lobby against the king. The Ottoman governor there refused to become a tool in their scheme and instead delivered them to Bejan. Tama was locked away, and the bishop, already notorious for scandal and contempt for clerical discipline, was stripped of office and humiliated. Shaken by these plots, Alexandra leaned more openly toward Vakhtang and toward coordination with eastern Georgia. Fighters from Imeretia joined Kartlian forces in raids toward Ganja in the early 1720s. An effort meant as much to prove loyalty as to win spoils. Yet the king still had to appease powerful houses at home, including Abashidze lords, who treated peasant families as merchandise and used the chaos to enrich themselves. Flight became a kind of silent referendum on rule. Villagers slipped away toward Kartli and Samtske in search of safer ground, even if that meant living under foreign masters. In Akaltsike, Ottoman administration was widely seen as morally rotten, but materially calmer. For peasants who had become slaves, dependents, or refugees there, the thought of returning to the old order did not always bring comfort. By 1722, Western Georgia was effectively wrapped in an Ottoman net. Kutaisi held a strong garrison of Janissaries, backed by heavy artillery, while smaller forces sat in Sukhumi and Poti, controlling movement along the coast. The wider diplomatic horizon collapsed soon after. Russia's decisions in the mid-1720s confirmed to many Georgians that no northern rescue was coming, and the gamble made by Vakhtang ended with exile. Alexandre had already sent envoys north in hope of assistance, and Shoshita of Racha followed with similar appeals, but silence answered them. In the vacuum, political calculations shifted. Guria drifted toward cooperation with the Ottomans, and the Abashidze faction surrendered a key border fortress to the empire. Even so, the Ottoman governor of Akhaltsiki did not rush to finish the conquest of Imeretia. Personal caution played a part, as did the reality that Istanbul viewed the region as secondary compared to the Balkans. Many garrisons were made up of locals, Georgians, or Abkhazians, and they mixed easily with the population, blurring the line between occupier and neighbour. Those years became remembered as a harsh season of Ottoman domination. In the east, King Constantine constantly hunted, avoided capture, and tried to keep resistance alive through raids and shifting alliances, even cooperating with northern fighters whose loyalty was bought with plunder. a messenger was sent to Russia to beg for help. But what was offered was refuge rather than intervention. Constantine's own rule carried contradictions. He held to Islam and was feared for his harshness toward common people. Yet he could not control the mercenaries who followed him, who demanded land and shares of revenue inside Kartli itself. Northern raiders pushed deeper, even into Samtskhe. But whenever they attempted to settle permanently in Kakhetiya, local communities turned on them with lethal force. Ottoman officials redrew the map as they pleased, assigning parts of eastern Kakhetiya to highland groups and relocating Ossetian communities deeper into Kartli. In Kartli, a Turkish-backed ruler sat under the eye of a Kaltsik as governor, and much of the country was divided into provinces administered by Georgian nobles, who answered upward to the Ottoman command. Economic pressure became relentless. Taxation came twice over, demanded by local authorities and again by Ottoman officials. Many families fled, others fell into debt bondage, and Christian landholders who stayed faced penalties that stripped them of standing and rights. Merchants lost old trade routes toward Iran, and Ottoman methods of punishment provoked fury. Public executions and brutal corporal penalties triggered rebellions, as did a deliberate humiliation of nobles who failed to meet demands quickly enough. Some were treated like animals, saddled and whipped as a warning to others. In the mountain valleys of Aragvi and Kasani, rival dukes drew punishment down on their own people as their feuds spiraled, leaving farms burned and villages scattered. One threat, however, forced rare cooperation. The growing raids from Dagestan for cattle and captives damaged not only Georgian lives, but also Ottoman revenue. When the raiding intensified, joint forces drove the attackers back, and defensive works were built through uneasy collaboration between local leaders and Ottoman command. Still, the damage was deeper than a single victory could repair. Refugee peasants did not return in large numbers. Emigration, renewed slave trading, and waves of disease reduced Kartli's population so sharply that wildlife moved into abandoned spaces and attacked those who remained. Kakhetiya suffered from neglect. Constantine's attention stayed fixed on ambitions in Kartli rather than rebuilding his own kingdom. Ottoman suspicion grew that Kakhetiya might tilt back toward Iran, and in late 1732 Constantine was murdered during negotiations with the governor of Akalchike. His brother Teimuraz fled into the mountains, but the Ottomans occupied Kakhetiya and, after he surrendered, installed him as king under their terms. The balance then shifted again as Iran recovered strength while the Ottoman position weakened. Georgian nobles wrote to Russia asking that Vakhtang return, but exile had broken his spirit. Iranian armies retook key towns and fortresses in the mid-1730s, pushing Russia off the Caspian shore and blocking many exiles from returning home. In Kartli, Givi Amilakori rose against Ottoman garrisons and cleared Gori, while Teimuraz and Iranian forces drove Ottomans and northern raiders out of Kakhetiya. In Tbilisi and Erevan, Ottoman positions collapsed under coordinated pressure from Iranian commanders and Georgian allies. By 1736, with Turkey fighting on multiple fronts, the empire abandoned Kartli and Kakhetiya. Freedom from one overlord did not mean relief. The new Iranian ruler distrusted Georgian elites and arrested several during negotiations. Iranian officials preferred to rule through a Muslim claimant rather than empower a Christian dynasty, and demands quickly became crushing. Tribute in cash was imposed on Tbilisi. Vast quantities of grain were demanded from the countryside, and military conscription followed. An Iranian general arrived with even harsher tax orders, splitting Georgian nobles into opposing camps. Some cooperated, Others backed Teymuraz and tried to strangle the Iranian garrison inside Tbilisi's citadel. Iran enforced its authority with soldiers, driving opponents into exile and back again. Yet the wider imperial strategy soon changed. With campaigns pulling Iranian attention far away, the Shah concluded that only a Christian monarchy could keep Kartli and Kakhetiya quiet without forcing Iran to fight on two fronts. Hostages were taken to guarantee obedience, including Teymuraz, his son Erekle, and a daughter whose marriage was arranged into the ruling circle. Erekle was drawn into the Iranian military machine, where his talent in war became unmistakable. After a period in Iran, Teymuraz returned to rule Kakhetiya. Given Iran's strength, his policy stayed outwardly loyal, even allowing Iran to influence major church appointments. At home, however, Kartli descended into feuds so savage that one duke butchered the people and soldiers of his neighbour, turning internal politics into open massacre. Northern raids helped force a broader alliance. Georgians wanted protection from hostage-taking raids that threatened even the capital, while Iran wanted a stable base against Russian pressure across the mountains. War against Dagestan drained Georgia further because Iran's disorganized army fed itself by requisition, demanding enormous shipments of grain and draft animals. Some Georgians even sided with the raiders and with Ottoman interests, deepening the sense that the country was being torn from within. Eventually, a pragmatic settlement emerged in which raiders were pushed toward trade rather than robbery. But funding this arrangement still required squeezing Georgia. An inventory was taken and everything taxable was counted: houses, livestock, vineyards. When harvests failed in the early 1740s, peasants again fled toward Ottoman territory, destroyed property to avoid tax collectors, or sold their children into slavery at desperate prices. Civil war combined with famine to produce a brutal reckoning. Teymuraz broke the power of rebellious duchies, used mountain fighters to punish certain valleys, and spent months crushing fortified strongholds. One last major rebel was handed over to Iran, and then, with tribute burdens eased, Teymuraz was confirmed as king of Kartli, while Erekle took Kakhetiya. Their joint coronation in 1745 became a turning point. For the first time in generations, a Persian ruler openly accepted Georgia's Christian kings, rather than forcing religious submission as the price of authority. Behind that outcome stood careful marriage politics and diplomacy used to soften Iranian suspicion. Even after recognition, danger returned. The Iranian ruler, increasingly unstable, armed former prisoners and threatened new punitive campaigns, then demanded that Erekle appear in Iran. Teymuraz went instead, calculating that persuasion was safer than defiance. Before any final confrontation, the Iranian ruler was assassinated, and the whole imperial structure fractured. Georgian leaders were suddenly courted as kingmakers in Iran's succession struggles. Iranian garrisons withdrew from Georgia and the country briefly breathed again. That vacuum invited new challengers. A rival claimant in Kartli raised rebellion, and Tbilisi became a battlefield. Cannon fire smashed palaces and shattered churches, towns were burned, and fear kept people awake for nights on end. Erekle crushed the revolt and then moved outward, raiding neighbouring khanates and forcing dependencies that restored something like Georgia's older frontier lines. Teymuraz returned in 1749 to a transformed political landscape. Eastern Georgia could now influence events beyond its borders, and foreign observers remarked that Erekle's power seemed to eclipse many competitors around him, limited only by the fact that he remained Christian in a region where the highest throne was expected to be Muslim. As Iran's succession wars continued, Georgian exiles and captives began drifting home. A forgiving Iranian ruler even overlooked the killing of an Iranian garrison in Tbilisi, instead sending gifts and honours. naming Teimuraz a commander and Erekile his deputy for the northern frontier. With Iran weakening, eastern Georgia entered a period of recovery. Wastelands began to bloom again, and the population, badly reduced earlier in the century, grew rapidly within a generation. Slave-trading nobles were pressured into public repentance before church authorities. Borders stabilized, and Imeretia's king remained tied to the eastern court through marriage alliances. Cultural work resumed as well. Printing restarted in Tbilisi with the goal of producing standardized religious texts and a consistent written language. The press was installed alongside the mint and staffed by skilled specialists from mixed backgrounds, later passing under local printers. Over decades, dozens of titles appeared, mostly liturgical, printed in substantial numbers, suggesting a deliberate attempt to rebuild institutions as well as morale. Western Georgia did not share fully in this upswing. Ottoman influence still weighed heavily on the coast and on strategic fortresses, and Alexandre V faced the same feudal storms that had ruined earlier rulers. His authority depended on Mingrelia's ruler, Bejan Dadiani, who avoided betrayal partly because the king surrounded himself with devoted guards. Together, they seized a fortress from a powerful churchman tied to the Racha elite and destroyed a key castle that symbolized local defiance. Yet the Ottoman grip remained. Castles such as Geguti and border points like Shorapani sat in the empire's shadow. In 1728, a trap was laid. An Abashidze leader requested that Akaltsike send a young Ottoman commander to Geguti. Bejan agreed to meet him under assurances of safety, and was murdered the moment he entered the fortress. After Bejan's death, Alexandre felt briefly unchained. He even cooperated with Ottoman forces against pirates and raiders along the coast. But this choice backfired. Mingrelia's new leadership interpreted collaboration as hostility, and Imeretia was suddenly treated as an enemy rather than an ally. Alexandre withdrew just as anti-Ottoman guerrilla action gained strength, but by then conspiracies were already forming. Mingrelia's ruler, the Abashidze faction, and the Duke of Racha plotted to unseat him. A rival candidate was promoted through marriage ties, and rebels blocked Alexandre inside Kutaisi's castle. They avoided artillery fire, not out of mercy, but out of fear that loud violence would trigger immediate Ottoman intervention. Alexandre tried to defend himself with new marital alliances, marrying into the Abashidze family, and binding Guriya by marrying his daughter into its ruling house. Plots continued anyway. The Duke of Racha and Mingrelia's ruler wanted Alexandre eliminated, and the king responded with bribery and promotions, even granting a churchman permission to abandon clerical life and rewarding him with a secular title to create a counterweight. The struggle turned into open war during the brutal winter of 1732. Mingrelia's leader was wounded and captured, his close kin were killed, and prisoners from Racha and Mingrelia were sold to the Ottomans to remove them as future threats and to finance immediate needs. Throughout these years, Alexandre kept searching for Russian help. One envoy's message from the Russian court was lost on the way home, a symbolic failure in a century full of missed connections. When Russia captured Azov in 1736, hope surged again, and a larger delegation travelled north with maps, oaths of loyalty, and plans for liberation, asking for tens of thousands of soldiers. That hope collapsed with a peace settlement that ended the Russo-Turkish War and removed any incentive for Russia to fight for Transcaucasia. Alexandre then attempted reconciliation. A wounded rival was nursed back to health and offered a governorship, but Ottoman policy favoured division. Istanbul threatened Alexandre with invasion unless Mingrelia's ruler was restored, and the king yielded, even sacrificing family ties to satisfy Ottoman commanders and surrendering land to a resentful brother. his treasury emptied. To pay Ottoman dues, he turned to the very slave trading he had earlier condemned, despite church protests. Shortages of silver were so severe across the region that even senior clergy reportedly settled obligations through human captives rather than coin. Marital politics became deadly. Alexandra executed close relatives by marriage for treason, and new conspiracies formed among the Abashidze and Mingrelia factions. Desperate, the king used northern Muslim fighters against Christian rivals, a move widely condemned. He soon dismissed them and forbade slave-taking to limit the scandal. The feud escalated into open destruction. In 1740, enemies burned the royal palace at Vartshike, and the king and queen narrowly escaped. The following year, an Ottoman army forced Alexandra to surrender the throne temporarily and leave with his family. At first, he was treated respectfully in Kartli, then imprisoned, released only after high-level intervention with Iran. Under Iranian pressure, the Ottoman governor of Akhaltsikhe restored him without waiting for orders from Istanbul. Back in Imeretia, opposition persisted, now led by his stepmother Tamar, a figure whose survival had depended on many patrons and who repaid gratitude everywhere except to the king who expected it. Alexandra executed her, expelled supporters of the rival faction, and sold the families of opponents into Ottoman markets. A leading conspirator fled, and even the Abashidze chief, now the king's father-in-law, found loyalties strained between family interest and political survival. Rebellion returned in 1743 and drove Alexandra again toward Akhaltsikhe to beg for help. This time, the Duke of Racha was killed. His successor respected the king for several years, but stability remained an illusion. Another uprising in 1746 placed Alexandra's brother on the throne, and only in 1749, with Ottoman assistance, did Alexandra recover power once more. He died in 1752 after a reign marked by constant betrayal, foreign pressure, and the exhausting work of survival. In the east, Kartli and Kakhetiya stood in sharp contrast. Under Erikale II, the state was consolidated, the army strengthened, and administration reorganized with an eye toward more systematic governance. The crown sought to rebuild the tax base by repopulating emptied districts. Officials were appointed to bring runaway serfs home or settle them on royal land, sometimes by persuasion, sometimes by force. Migrants were drawn from Ottoman-held areas with promises of tax relief, and Christian highlanders were moved into productive valleys. Efforts were made to attract settlers from the north, including refugees and outsiders, though Russian authorities blocked some of these plans. Armenian communities were also relocated into strategic zones, such as southern Kakhetiya, Tbilisi, and Gori, not always by choice. Programs to restore vineyards and orchards were reported, and even families from Iran were brought in to rebuild certain towns. This repopulation did not mean gentleness. Erekle accepted coercion as a tool of order, and complaints from serfs were not treated with sympathy. At the same time, landowners were held responsible when peasants ran away, and abuses by nobles, including sexual exploitation, were punished more harshly than before. Laws were introduced to restrict the sale of serfs apart from land, and returning captives were promised freedom as peasants on royal estates. A growing category of free workers appeared, drawn from former soldiers, church dependents, and people who had survived captivity. Economic policy aimed at stability. New grains were introduced in the highlands, prices were managed to keep bread affordable, and famine became less frequent. Taxes could be paid in produce, not only in coin. Manufacturing expanded into sugar, glass, cloth, and weapons, while gunpowder remained under royal monopoly. mines and foundries staffed by skilled Greek workers produced valuable metals and significant quantities of silver. Merchants gained legal protections that shielded inheritance from royal confiscation, and customs duties in Tbilisi rose sharply in the 1760s. Trade with Iran continued, but Russia became a major buyer of silk and horses, paying with manufactured goods, paper, and textiles. Institutions multiplied. Courts were reorganized. The Royal Council functioned as a standing high court and governing body, and ministries gathered into a smaller executive circle. Foreign affairs were handled through parallel offices representing different confessional communities, and the mayor of Tbilisi gained real influence. A police force was established, marking a shift toward more regular state control of urban life. As Kartli strengthened, Christian communities under Ottoman rule grew bolder, and many moved eastward. Erikli welcomed them, seeing demographic change as a foundation for reclaiming regions lost to centuries of Ottoman dominance. This expansion of authority also triggered resistance. Landowners pushed harder, and peasants sometimes exploded in violence when demands exceeded customary labour obligations. Estates were attacked, churches burned, and stores of wine and produce seized. Highland communities destroyed castles and took lords hostage for weeks at a time. Even plans to revive old duchies could ignite rebellion. When the crown introduced compulsory loans from wealthy households to fund the state, resentment rose again, revealing the limits of reform in a society still marked by deep inequality and the lingering scars of war. Through the 1750s, Teimuraz and Erikli pushed outward with unusual speed and confidence, driving campaigns to the south and east that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. Their troops pressed into Muslim-ruled districts, and the frontier zone that had long been a source of raids and tribute began, at least temporarily, to tilt toward Tbilisi. Local rulers in places like Karabagh and Ganja accepted Georgian dominance in practice, whether from fear, calculation, or the promise of stability. Erikli's ambition went further than border security. He reached deep into the Iranian political arena, at one point taking Tabriz and inserting himself into the struggles that followed Iran's internal fragmentation. When Azat Khan's Afghan and Uzbek forces challenged the authority of Shah Rukh, Erikli fought them, broke their momentum, and carried Azat Khan back to Georgia, where the defeated contender spent years confined in Tbilisi. These were not symbolic raids, but hard tests of strength, and they created a new reality. For the first time in many centuries, the main Georgian heartland was spared direct war. Battles raged beyond the borders, but the farms and towns of Kartli and Kakhetiya did not become the battlefield. The victories did not make the rulers invincible. A sharp reversal in early 1751 showed how fragile success could be. The Khan of Shaki surprised Erikli's forces, defeated them, and came close to capturing the king himself. That near disaster did not stop the broader momentum, but it reminded everyone that the frontier could still bite back. Foreign observers noticed the change. In diplomatic circles, Erikli began to be spoken of, not as a regional prince surviving between empires, but as a ruler who could impose decisions across a wide arc of territory. Even so, Georgia's growing reach created new anxieties. Russia, which once seemed the obvious patron, watched these conquests with mixed feelings. Open support now looked risky. St. Petersburg did not want to provoke the Ottomans, and it was unsettled by Georgia's increasing involvement in Iranian affairs, where Erikli's talent and luck could, in the eyes of some, carry him dangerously high. While campaigns expanded abroad, the old northern menace never disappeared. Dagestani raiders continued to test the frontier year after year. A peace understanding with one group in 1752 did not end the violence. Throughout the decade, Avar forces crossed into Kakheti and Kartli in large bands, often avoiding set battles but leaving destruction behind. They burned, looted, seized cattle, and carried people off, then retreated into the mountains before a decisive confrontation could form. The pattern was exhausting and demoralizing, and it demanded pressure from the north if it was to be reduced. Teimuraz, still hoping for a protective partner, decided to take the request directly to Russia. In 1760, he travelled north, seeking troops or money to hire fighters, and he floated grand schemes meant to tempt Russian strategists, including the idea of reshaping power in Iran through a friendly figure. The timing could not have been worse. Russia was absorbed by a major European war and had little appetite for a costly Caucasian commitment. Teimuraz returned with nothing solid in his hands. On the journey back, he died suddenly in Astrakhan in January 1762, leaving Erekle to inherit both Kartli and Kakheti, and, with them, the full weight of the region's expectations. The northern journey had consequences even after Teimuraz was gone. In western Iran, the dominant powerholder, Karim Khan, interpreted Kartli and Kakheti as a potential wedge inside Iranian politics. From his perspective, Georgian diplomacy with Russia looked like a hidden blade. Erekle tried to calm the suspicion and denied that his father's plan posed a threat, but the distrust lingered. Karim Khan held back from invading, largely because local Azerbaijani rulers had aligned themselves with Erekle, and a major assault could have turned into a costly quagmire. Russia, however, complicated the picture further. European powers pressured it to avoid expanding Caucasian commitments, and St. Petersburg began playing a cautious, double-sided game. Alternative royal claimants were kept in reserve, and some of them had quiet support inside Georgia. One such figure was Parta, an illegitimate son of the exiled Vakhtang. He had real technical training, knew artillery and cannon founding, and returned to Kartli in 1752, bitter and resentful after a life in Russia, constrained by a small pension and close supervision. His frustration found an audience among dissatisfied nobles and ambitious families, including factions that felt personally wronged by Erekle's decisions. A marriage dispute involving the king's sister became one spark in a wider fire. By 1765, a serious conspiracy was in motion, reaching beyond the court into the merchant world of Tbilisi, and even into the provincial lower classes. The plot did not collapse because of careful state surveillance, but because someone from the artisan class betrayed it first, exposing the network before it could strike. Erekle chose to make the reckoning public and political, rather than private and silent. A large council was assembled to hear the case openly, and it did not consist only of grandees. People of humble status were included in the proceedings, to underline that the state was judging treason as a crime against the whole realm, not merely against a royal household. Erekle himself appeared and testified, then deliberately refused to dictate the outcome, allowing the court to deliver verdicts and punishments. Many were acquitted, but the sentences for the core group were brutal. Parta was executed along with another leading conspirator. Others were subjected to punishments that aimed to mark them permanently: cutting, burning, imprisonment, and mutilation. This was a harsh form of order, reflecting a belief that the kingdom, newly stabilized, could not afford to appear soft. After that crisis, Russian policy did not become friendlier. Another rival was pushed toward the Georgian scene, a prince raised in Russia with military experience and dynastic credentials as a grandson of Vakhtang. Released in 1766, he moved through Iran seeking backing, then turned toward western Georgia and attempted to stir trouble around Tbilisi. When that failed, he drifted toward Dagestan, linking himself to forces that had long been Georgia's scourge. At Erikles' request, Russian authorities eventually arrested him, and he died years later in a distant prison. The episode revealed the grim truth of Georgian diplomacy. Even when Russia restrained a rival, it did so on its own terms, not as an ally bound by obligation. By the 1770s, Erikles began reshaping his army with outside expertise, drawing on Russian advisors, manuals, and rank structures. A royal guard became the nucleus of a more permanent, paid force, though old habits persisted and soldiers still expected opportunities for loot. Weapons production remained improvised. Gunpowder was made in Tbilisi in a workshop that mixed ingredients through crude machinery, relying on human power and heavy tools more suited to a carpenter's yard than a modern arsenal. In 1774, a form of compulsory service was introduced. Each household owed one male for limited annual duty, equipped and fed at his own expense. The military effort moved forward, but civic life lagged behind. Visitors described the capital as crowded and unhealthy, its buildings fragile, its sanitation poor, its windows often covered with treated paper because glass was scarce. When plague struck in 1770, thousands died, and the city's weaknesses were exposed in the harshest way. In western Georgia, a different drama unfolded. In 1752, Solomon inherited the throne of Imeretiia while still a teenager, and his reign marked a turning point after decades of chaos. Hopes for Georgian reunification revived, at least in the imagination of Eastern rulers, who watched Imeretia's struggles with a mix of frustration and desire. Solomon possessed the determination needed to confront both Ottoman interference and the predatory habits of his own nobility. But he began surrounded by enemies, including members of his own family. Powerful figures forced him to flee to Akaltsike and place himself under Ottoman protection. The Ottoman governor sheltered the young king, expecting pliability, and Solomon played the role of a submissive client, just long enough to regain his position. Once restored, he moved quickly and ruthlessly. His mother was exiled, close relatives were imprisoned, estates were confiscated, and punitive expeditions were used to intimidate rivals in Guria. The message was clear. The throne would no longer be a prize passed around by factions. Solomon also understood that alliances were survival. He revised his marital ties with calculated coldness, breaking an earlier marriage and linking himself to Mingrelia, the strongest neighbouring principality, through a new queen who proved educated and politically useful. He then rebuilt relationships with former enemies and courted lesser nobles, trying to isolate the most dangerous oligarchs. Popular support mattered, and he sought it through campaigns framed as moral renewal, suppressing slave trading and resisting religious pressure from the Ottoman system. The problem was that Ottoman dues still had to be paid, and a devastated country lacked money and goods. Human beings had become the currency of the coast, especially young captives. Ottoman penetration had not merely occupied fortresses, it had warped trade, weakened institutions, and corroded the moral authority of the church, the traditional backbone of resistance. Solomon tried to reverse that. Church lands and dependents seized by lay lords were restored, and many church taxes were lifted. Then the king escalated further by making slave trading a capital crime, striking directly at the wealth of leading houses, who had used people to pay for everything from weapons to luxury items. The punishments were designed to terrify. Executions were carried out in ways meant to be remembered, and fear became an instrument of policy. Alongside brutality, Solomon pursued a practical recovery plan. He copied Eastern methods of repopulation and agricultural revival and tried, at least in one notable decree, to restrain the crushing labour demands that had driven peasants into flight. He also attacked the physical foundations of noble independence by dismantling the castles that made defiance possible. At the same time, he built a new structure of loyalty through a system of sworn service. Each year in mid-May, large assemblies formed in a meadow, gathering adult males bound by oath, their clergy carrying icons, and, during wartime, sizable armed contingents. The ritual combined religion, politics, and spectacle. Oaths were renewed and feasts followed, creating a shared identity around the crown. Sworn men gained direct access to the king and broad legal protections, with treason as the main unforgivable line. This domestic consolidation provoked Ottoman countermeasures. The governor of Akalsike tried to undermine Solomon by promoting rival claimants, stirring up the Abashidze faction, and leaning on the semi-independent Duchy of Racha, whose natural defences made it exceptionally hard to subdue. In 1757, an Ottoman-backed invasion moved into Imeretia under the leadership of Levan Abashidze. The country split along regional lines. Upper Imeretia rose against Solomon, while Lower Imeretia stayed loyal. Ottoman forces held the citadels, and the outcome seemed uncertain. Solomon responded by mobilizing every fighting man available, supported by allies from Guria and Mingrelia. The decisive clash came in December 1757 at Kresili, a battle that became a symbol of Imeretia's return from the edge. The Ottoman army was shattered at high cost, and in the confusion, key Georgian factions shifted sides. The Ottoman governor was killed, Levan Abashidze fell, and Rostam of Racha escaped back into his mountain stronghold. Fighting continued the next year, with setbacks followed by a final victory that confirmed Solomon's position. Ottoman pressure did not disappear. Solomon accepted tribute but refused to restart the export of slaves, drawing retaliation in the form of raids, plunder, and attacks on monasteries. In one dramatic episode, Solomon travelled to Akalsike to protest and returned with Ottoman troops supposedly assigned to punish the garrisons responsible for looting. Before these troops even crossed into Imeretia, Solomon's sworn men massacred them, turning a diplomatic manoeuvre into a bloodbath. The fiasco cost the Ottoman governor his life, and a new governor took his place. Negotiations resumed, and Solomon sent his queen to talk, but the Ottomans insisted on slave exports as the price of peace, and the talks collapsed. In 1758, Solomon pushed the reunification idea from symbolism to policy. He met Erekle at Gori and signed a mutual assistance agreement. They had already helped each other against northern raiders, and Solomon began employing officers trained in Eastern methods. The following years saw joint military efforts and the movement of forces across regions that earlier decades of rivalry had made impossible. Ottoman punitive expeditions were repeatedly repelled, and attempts to invade through Kartli were blocked by Erekle's forces. With Iran too weak to enforce older restrictions on cooperation between Georgian rulers, the two kings carved out room for action. Solomon then turned to institutional rebuilding. A combined assembly and church council was convened that included neighbouring principalities, and for weeks the agenda focused on church reorganisation and the suppression of slave trading. The church was repositioned as an active instrument of state policy, with revived bishoprics, restored properties, legal protections from lay interference, and disciplinary reforms aimed at purging corruption. It was a deliberate strategy: strengthen the church to strengthen national resistance, and use religious legitimacy to weaken the noble marketplace in human beings. The Ottoman response grew more aggressive. Rival claimants were armed and promoted, and by the mid-1760s the empire tried to replace Solomon with a nephew willing to sell slaves openly. Turkish forces invaded, intimidated allies, and pressured key princes. In 1766, under Ottoman bayonets, and with the backing of slave-trading lords, the nephew was crowned in Kutaisi. Solomon escaped with only a handful of followers and took refuge in a loyal fortress. Yet the Ottoman occupation was costly, and maintaining tens of thousands of soldiers in hostile territory drained resources. Diplomatic pressure also rose, including protests from Russia's representatives. A deal was floated, and Erekli was asked to mediate. Solomon accepted terms that looked humiliating on paper, involving annual delivery of girls, but neither side intended to keep faith. Solomon had no intention of becoming a supplier of captives, and the Ottomans had no intention of restoring him fully unless they could control him. Before the arrangement could settle, Solomon used northern fighters to smash the coalition supporting his nephew, captured him, and removed him from the political stage. A larger war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire then erupted, and both Georgian kings tried once again to turn imperial conflict into Georgian advantage. Solomon had appealed to Russia repeatedly, sometimes asking for protection, sometimes warning that defeat would drive him into exile. As the war began, the Ottoman Sultan even issued language recognizing Solomon's status in unusually respectful terms. Solomon also pursued unfinished business at home by targeting Racha, a long-standing duchy with recognized autonomy, strong defences, and its own ecclesiastical power. The terrain made conventional artillery campaigns difficult, and even Solomon's advisors worried the attack was reckless. Still, he forced the issue and achieved a partial success in early 1769, though he failed to capture the Duke himself. The struggle soon became entangled with Ottoman manoeuvres and church politics, leading to arrests, escapes, and the reshaping of religious offices to fit Solomon's needs. In the name of ending civil war and preparing for the wider conflict, Solomon eventually made peace with the Duke of Racha and staged a lavish reconciliation, complete with public oaths, ceremonial hospitality, and extended feasting. Then, the peace was betrayed with calculated cruelty. The Duke and his sons were separated from their guards at a river crossing, seized, and blinded in a coordinated assault. The act was so monstrous that it should have shattered Solomon's legitimacy. Yet the expectation of Russian military intervention silenced many potential critics. The duchy was abolished, lands confiscated, families displaced, and the survivors pushed into exile or forced submission. Some later returned to pursue revenge, and the cycle of violence extended into the next generation. Russian assistance proved far smaller than Georgian hopes had demanded. Instead of a great army, only a few hundred troops arrived with artillery and commanders whose behaviour quickly poisoned cooperation. Georgian kings were treated with contempt. Advice was ignored. Supply failures were blamed on locals, and strategic priorities tilted toward Russia's own naval ambitions on the Black Sea rather than Georgian liberation. Russian forces withdrew repeatedly at critical moments, failed to block Ottoman movements, and even encouraged regional nobles to break away from their kings and submit to Russia directly. Attempts to capture key coastal fortresses ended in disease and collapse. By 1772, Russian troops had withdrawn entirely, leaving western Georgia exposed to Ottoman reprisals. Guria paid a severe price, including forced conversions and administrative absorption into an Ottoman province. The episode taught a bitter lesson. Imperial intervention could be as destabilizing as occupation. Erekli responded with a last major attempt at formal protection. A senior church leader was sent to St. Petersburg with terms that tried to preserve Georgian sovereignty while securing a fixed Russian military presence. The offer included hostages, taxes, and supplies if key regions returned to Georgian control. Russia did not commit. Even so, Solomon and Erekli renewed their alliance and continued intermittent campaigns in Samtskhe, while Erekli acted as a mediator in Western disputes and helped repel Ottoman incursions. A major Ottoman treaty later restricted what Russia claimed it could do, but it also limited Ottoman claims over Imeretian captives and demanded pardons for certain acts of resistance. In practice, that legal language did not guarantee safety. South of the Rioni, Ottoman freedom of action remained broad, and the border world stayed dangerous. By the late 1770s, Solomon had achieved enough strength to subdue Mingrelia and the remnants of Guria, and Ottoman diplomacy shifted tone, sending an envoy with gifts to Kutaisi for the first time. The Western church hierarchy was reunified, and the regional political structure looked more coherent than it had in decades. Yet even at this point, the partnership between Solomon and Erekli began to fray. Each king had different strategic instincts. Erekli, facing threats on the eastern frontier and needing breathing space, chose to ease pressure on Ottoman territory and opened warmer communication with Istanbul, receiving honorific gifts that signaled recognition. Solomon preferred a counterweight in Iran and viewed Erekli's Ottoman accommodation as a betrayal of the Western struggle. A new danger rose in northern Azerbaijan, where a powerful leader began consolidating territory that threatened Kaketia's eastern edge. Tribute arrangements shifted, and Erekli found himself fighting to maintain influence over Ganja and nearby Sanatis. He pressed aggressively, occupying Erevan and demanding full surrender rather than negotiated submission. The city was looted, many Armenians were carried into Georgia, and governance was reshaped through a Georgian-backed authority. These actions alarmed both Russia and Iran, and they also forced Erekli to sprint back to Kartli to suppress a pretender supported from the north. Russian officials disliked not only Erekli's regional ambitions, but also his demographic plans, including proposals to settle northern peoples in Georgia to expand military manpower. To cool him down and limit his reach, Russia encouraged the rise of his Azerbaijani rival, making clear that Georgian strength would be permitted only up to the point where it did not interfere with imperial strategy. As Ottoman forces gathered again on Imeretia's edges in 1778, Solomon looked for leverage wherever it might still exist. He quietly dispatched the poet and seasoned envoy Besiki, known in court circles as Bessarion Gabashvili, on a risky journey through Astrakhan toward Iran. The mission had two purposes that did not sit comfortably together. One was defensive, to explore whether Iran could be persuaded, bought, or coaxed into distracting the Ottomans. The other was sharper and more cynical, to retrieve Alexandre Bakaris Dzey, a Kartlian pretender, and use him as a pressure point against Solomon's former partner, Erekli. In Astrakhan, the provincial authorities dragged their feet. Permissions were delayed, obstacles multiplied, and the traveller was treated as a nuisance. Eventually, the governor allowed Besiki to continue, and the decision was not hard to interpret. A pretender returned to Georgia would weaken Erekli, and a weaker Erekli suited Russian interests far more than a confident, expanding king on the southern frontier. Then the calculation shifted overnight. In 1779, Karim Khan died, and with him went Imeretia's last realistic hope of Iranian backing against Ottoman pressure. Still, Besiki did not return empty-handed. By autumn, he had escorted Alexandre Bakaris Dzey from Shiraz to Imeretia, placing a live dynastic weapon into Solomon's hands. The gesture deepened a personal and political rupture that had been building for years. Each king was now sheltering the other's troublemakers. Solomon's estranged son, also named Alexandre, lived at Erekli's court with his followers. In Kutaisi, the son of the former Duke of Ksani found protection, and the influential Gabashvili clan settled into the city as guests who were also symbols. The Gabashvili story itself reflected the uneasy blend of faith, politics, and personality that shaped Georgian elite life. Zakhar Gabashvili had once served as Erekli's chaplain, but he clashed fiercely with Catholicos Anton over church direction and cultural orientation, especially Anton's openness to Western ideas and Catholic contacts. Anton stepped aside for a time and left for Russia, only to return later and regain his position. Zakhar, increasingly isolated, fled eastward politics and crossed into Imereti in 1771. His son Basiki then inflamed the situation further. His verse was deliberately scandalous, and his affairs crossed social boundaries in ways that turned enemies into zealots. Anton's circle denounced him in apocalyptic language, and Erekli's court found him impossible to tolerate. Basiki escaped to Imereti and, once there, became Solomon's most effective diplomatic voice. Yet the sheltering of rivals cut both ways. Solomon's protection of the Kartlian pretender and Erekli's protection of the prodigal Imeretian prince poisoned relations between the two crowns. The crisis eased only because both sources of provocation disappeared, one fleeing north into Dagestan, the other dying before reconciliation could become urgent. Solomon, meanwhile, was left to confront the Ottomans without a reliable partner. In 1781, he attempted to force a breakthrough in Ajaria and failed. Russia's seizure of Crimea in 1783 looked, at first glance, like a turning point that might finally squeeze Ottoman power along the Black Sea. But the Sultan warned Solomon not to flirt with St. Petersburg. Solomon was only 48, yet worn by war and illness. His heir had died, and he had no children to secure succession. That vulnerability pushed him toward a dramatic solution, ending the feud with Erekli and arranging a dynastic bridge that could merge Imereti with Kartli-Kaketia. He sent his chaplain to Tbilisi to propose a formal adoption of Erekli's grandson, David Achilles Dizi, as Imereti's future king. Erekli, after sounding out Russia's representative, agreed and sent the boy west. Even as that plan unfolded, Solomon took one last offensive gamble. With around 6,000 men, he marched into Guria. Despite repeated betrayals from Mingrelia's leadership, local support helped him strike at the coast. He captured Kobaleti, a port held by Ottoman forces, and his retaliation was ferocious. Non-Georgians were slaughtered, and the land around the ruined garrison was deliberately ruined to prevent reoccupation, ploughed and salted as a warning. Solomon then moved south, ravaged Batumi, and withdrew, leaving destruction behind rather than attempting to hold ground that could not be defended long-term. The counterstroke came quickly. On March 9, 1784, in the forests near Nachishkrevi, Ottoman forces ambushed Solomon's army. The fight was chaotic and brutal. Solomon's horse was killed, and only the intervention of Vakhtang, Prince of Guria, prevented the king from being taken. The losses were heavy, hundreds dead, prominent nobles among them. Captives marched away toward Trabzon to be sold. The consequences were not temporary. The Ottomans retained Ajaria and a large part of Guria for generations. That single defeat broke the aura Solomon had built over 3 decades. A few weeks later, on 23rd of April, while travelling toward the feast of St. George at Coney, he collapsed as he mounted his horse and died. In Istanbul, the messenger who delivered the news was rewarded. In Kutaisi and beyond, nobles wrote to Russia in the language of abandonment, describing themselves as a people suddenly left without a father. By then, Russian policy was already shifting. Around 1782, Catherine's ministers began asking whether the moment had arrived to bind Georgia more tightly to Russia. Imereti looked exposed to the Ottomans, Kartli Kakhetiya looked too independent, too ambitious, too difficult to control. In St. Petersburg, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were increasingly imagined as buffers, a chain of territories that could separate Iran and Turkey and contain the wider Muslim highlands. Russian planners also saw a broader European design. There was a joint vision with Austria to drive the Ottomans back from Europe. An influence in Transcaucasia could support that ambition. Envoys and intermediaries were set in motion. A well-connected traveller and negotiator was sent to probe Ercles' intentions, while a trusted Russian commander took charge of forces in the Caucasus. Ercles did not greet these moves with simple relief. He suspected a trap. He tried to widen his options by appealing to Europe for money and political support, presenting the request as a defensive need against the Ottomans. Missionaries and clerics carried letters westward. Plans were made, messengers were sent, and hopes were pinned on distant courts. Yet one envoy died before reaching his destination, and another collapsed on the road. The effort produced sympathy, but no armies, no treasury shipments, no binding guarantees. In practice, the choice narrowed again until Russia could dictate terms. Those terms arrived in 1783, signed far from Tbilisi, in the North Caucasus. The agreement demanded that the king of Kartli and Kakhetiya abandon all outside allegiance and accept Russia as the sole protector. It promised to preserve the kingdom's territory, yet it quietly placed a new chain around the crown. Future monarchs would require Russian approval and formal recognition. Foreign diplomacy would be restricted, with negotiations dependent on Russian consent. Russian representatives would live inside the kingdom. In return, Russia declared that an enemy of Georgia would be an enemy of Russia, and that peace agreements with Turkey or Persia would include Kartli Kakhetiya as well. The treaty also asserted that the throne would remain hereditary and that Russia would not interfere in internal governance, but the fine print pulled in the opposite direction. Other clauses revealed the imbalance. Georgia would support Russia militarily and align promotions and service with Russian interests. The head of the Georgian church would be placed under the authority of Russia's ecclesiastical hierarchy, an insult to the tradition of Georgian ecclesiastical independence and a warning signal to anyone who understood the deeper meaning of church autonomy. There were incentives meant to sweeten the pill. Nobles could be recognized within the Russian aristocratic order. Free men would have rights of movement and residence within Russia. Prisoners could be repatriated if expenses were paid. And merchants could trade with fewer obstacles. Secret provisions went further. Russia positioned itself as arbiter between Ercole and Solomon, promised infantry and cannon for Tbilisi, claimed command in any major war, and dangled the most tempting prize of all: the restoration of historically Georgian territories. Inside Georgia, not everyone saw this as salvation. Many judged the deal harsher than earlier forms of imperial overlordship because it strangled foreign policy at the very moment when speed mattered most. Crossing the Caucasus could take months, and waiting for permission could turn a warning into a catastrophe. Church clauses felt like an attack on identity itself. Military promises sounded impressive on paper. Yet everyone knew how unreliable the mountain passes could be and how often Russia's priorities shifted elsewhere. Ercole understood the risk better than most. He had been burned before by imperial games, watched stronger states partition weaker ones, and knew how quickly protection could become possession. Still, Ercole and his closest advisors concluded that there were no clean alternatives. Russia was advancing steadily across the region toward the Black Sea and the Caspian. Standing aside meant being treated as a problem to be solved later. Joining meant becoming a tool, but at least a tool that might survive. For a brief moment, the new arrangement looked as if it might work. In late 1783, a rival pretender was handed over to Russia, removing a dangerous wildcard. In January 1784, Russian regiments marched into Tbilisi under ceremonial salutes and ringing bells, and formal ratification followed. Lists of nobles were submitted. Russian commanders encouraged Erekli to think bigger, even hinting at a push toward the Caspian and scouting future battle zones. European powers watched with unease. The Ottomans warned Erekli not to allow Russian presence to spread into sensitive border provinces, and began recruiting northern fighters as a deterrent. Dagestani groups, now seeing Kartli, Kakhetiya, and Russia as a single hostile bloc, intensified raids. Instead of security, the treaty also painted a larger target on the kingdom. Solomon's death in 1784 shattered what stability Western Georgia had regained. The adopted successor was still an infant, and the throne passed to another David, a compromise figure whose position was fragile from the first day. To stay in power, he bribed nobles, surrendered border territory to Mingrelia, and cracked down on peasants who were killing tax collectors. He revived the Duchy of Racha and installed a relative there, reopening an old fault line. He also made marriage decisions that angered Erekli and rearranged the political map, with generous dowries paid in land. The Ottomans reacted by reinforcing coastal fortresses and supporting alternative candidates. Russia's representative urged the new king to fight, but David refused to turn his people into expendable soldiers for someone else's war. Imeretiya tried to seek protection directly, sending senior church figures north, pleading for help against both foreign pressure and internal rivals. Diplomatic protests in Istanbul achieved little. At times, Ottoman forces backed down only when it looked as though Erekli and Russia might intervene, then returned the moment the threat faded. The coast was blockaded. Mingrelian leaders begged St. Petersburg for action. Dagestani forces crossed Georgian lands and ravaged Lower Imeretiya. Only after strong Russian protests did Ottoman support for one claimant weaken, allowing David to stabilize briefly by buying off some enemies and driving others into exile. Even then, violence continued. Invaders were burned in their forts, threats of revenge followed, and peasant uprisings flared again as hunger and extortion squeezed the countryside. In 1787, David again turned to Basiki, sending him north under the cover of negotiations. Rumours swirled around the mission and around Basiki himself. He lingered for years in the borderlands of the Russian Empire, effectively blocked from reaching the court where decisions were made. Then, war exploded again. The Ottomans invaded Imeretiya in 1787, and David was forced to submit. The treaty that was supposed to bind Russia to Georgia did not translate into rescue, and Erekli, calculating survival, had already made a separate non-aggression arrangement with the Ottomans. David fought regional rivals with shifting alliances and found that even Russia, on the verge of new war, offered only words. In 1789, exhausted and cornered, he surrendered the throne to the child who had been marked as Solomon's successor. The boy took the royal name Solomon II, and the new arrangement was sealed with an alliance that mirrored the earlier Russian agreement in its structure of mutual promises and shared danger. A senior churchman later helped calm the country, and David accepted the reduced status of crown prince, even handing over a son as a guarantee. In the east, the Russian presence proved thin and conditional. A joint action in 1785 captured hundreds of raiders. But Russia's real priority lay to the north, where revolt and holy war threatened its frontier. The Dagestani raiders moved too fast for Georgian artillery and too freely through the terrain to be stopped consistently. Erekli resorted to tribute, paying Omar Khan yearly funding it with a special tax openly associated with the northern threat. Russian commanders also paid Omar Khan separately to protect strategic mining interests guarded by Russian soldiers. These payments, combined with the cost of feeding Russian troops, crushed peasant households. In 1786, even nobles demanded military help to put down rural revolts, a sign that the social order was fraying under the combined weight of taxation, raids, and forced service. Russia's own representative painted a bleak picture of Ercles' realm. Roads unsafe, people hiding from raiders and recruiters, trade choked, and former vassal Kanates drifting away toward Ottoman influence. Even Armenian communities, despite their Christian ties, feared the consequences of Russian protection. The regular army Erekli had been building weakened after the death of a key prince, and requests for additional Russian soldiers were ignored. Worse still, in 1787, when a new Russo-Turkish war began, the Russian garrison in Kartli was pulled out for operations elsewhere, leaving Erekli exposed. The earlier betrayal that Georgians remembered from the previous century seemed to replay itself in a new form. Ottoman diplomats demanded that Russia renounce its claim of protection over eastern Georgia. Russia, focused on holding Crimea rather than fighting for Transcaucasia, effectively told Erekli to manage his neighbours alone. Erekli protested bitterly, telling Russian commanders he had become a mockery in the eyes of enemies and hinting that the agreement might be meaningless if protection vanished when it was most needed. His advisors urged a hard pivot, repair relations with Turkey and open channels toward Iran as well. A new Iranian warlord, rising rapidly, sounded at first like a potential partner because he wanted international recognition of his claims. Erekli moved quickly, making peace with the Ottomans despite humiliating opening demands, and benefiting from the fact that Istanbul had other urgent wars and wanted calm in the east. He also aligned with a Persian claimant, which in turn provoked fresh attacks from Dagestan. The goal was not trust, but time. Border governors played their own games. A powerful Ottoman official in Childa, descended from Georgian dynasts of earlier centuries, sought accommodation with Erekli because the northern mercenaries he sheltered were expensive and uncontrollable. These riders lived by looting and used hidden forest routes that let them cross Georgia unseen. In 1786, an understanding was reached. Erekli would block further Russian troop entry into the region, and the Ottoman side would keep regular forces from crossing into his realm. The arrangement held for several years and even produced bizarre moments, when Ottoman officials borrowed Christian soldiers from Erekli to crush Muslim raiders, shocking local sensibilities. Erekli justified this double game by pointing to the obvious fact that Russia had not kept its side of the bargain. Many Georgian nobles blamed him anyway. His own letters from 1786 show a ruler caught between impossible choices, doubting where help could be found and fearing that every direction led to humiliation. To hold his coalition together, he convened councils and sent envoys to both Ottoman and Iranian centres, masking the latter mission with harmless explanations in communications to Russia. In the West, the easing of pressure from a Kaltsikhe encouraged renewed talk of unification. Clergy and delegates from multiple principalities begged Erekli to bring all Georgia under one crown, and a council in 1789 supported immediate reunification, with Erekli's heir speaking openly about the danger of division. Court politics blocked it. Erekli's second wife favoured a different dynastic future, wanted her own grandson to rule in the West independently, and her influence kept the kingdoms separate even when drafts for a formal union were prepared. The internal strain continued to rise. In 1789, peasants, impoverished by endless taxes and war burdens, demanded a new king and an end to extortion by royal relatives who extracted grain, livestock, and wine. Russia offered material aid that was useful only indirectly, sending metal supplies Erikli could sell to raise ransom money for captives, while avoiding any serious military commitment. Then, another peace agreement between Russia and the Ottoman Empire arrived in 1791, and Georgia was once again treated as a bargaining chip. Russia kept what mattered most to it. The fate of Georgia was barely mentioned, and western Georgia remained under Ottoman dominance. Basiki, still trying to argue Imeretia's case, died of fever before any meaningful concessions were secured. That same year, Erikli made a dynastic decision that would haunt his kingdom. Under pressure from his second household, he signed a testament that altered succession, requiring his eldest son to pass the throne, not to his own heir, but to a half-brother from Erikli's later marriage, if that half-brother proved worthy. The choice created a crack in the future of the crown at the very moment external danger was hardening into certainty. The Iranian leader, who had once seemed negotiable, became Shah and no longer sought Georgian friendship, only Georgian submission. For the first time in centuries, Ottoman policy explicitly recognized Iranian claims over Kartli and Kakhetiya, signaling that Georgia could be sacrificed in a larger balance of power trade. Russian commanders warned Erikli in 1792 that only diplomacy would be offered if Iran attacked. Ottoman agents encouraged Sunni allies in Dagestan and in the southern Khanates to pressure Georgia. Russian court attention to Georgian appeals cooled. Even the Georgian ambassador was ignored for long stretches. By 1794, the Iranian Shah was openly preparing for invasion. Erikli repaired the highway across the Caucasus and pleaded for a small Russian force to fulfill the promise of protection. The request was refused. In 1795, the storm finally broke. Fighting erupted in Karabakh. Refugees poured north, and a massive army crossed the Araxes, abandoning other objectives to march straight toward Georgia. In September, an ultimatum arrived, written in the language of imperial inheritance and contempt. It reminded Erikli that Georgia had long been considered within Iran's orbit, mocked the idea that Russia could protect anything beyond its trade interests, and warned that refusal would bring a campaign so violent that the rivers themselves would seem to run larger with blood. The message was not negotiation. It was the announcement of a reckoning. Erikli's inner circle could not agree on a single course. Some urged submission to buy time. Others insisted that yielding would only invite a slower death. Erikli chose defiance. He refused to answer the ultimatum with obedience. Yet he still sent riders north with urgent pleas, hoping Russia would finally treat its promise as more than ink. The response was cold. In Georgievsk, General Gudovich remained seated behind orders that prioritized calm over commitment. He was told to avoid trouble, keep costs down, and not be drawn into a war that might inconvenience the imperial budget. While messages and gifts moved quietly between Gudovich's camp and the Iranian court, Erikli gathered what strength he could and marched south with Solomon II and a contingent from western Georgia, trying to meet the danger before it reached the capital. The effort came late. Deals had already been cut in the south. In the Armenian ecclesiastical centre, a huge payment was offered to purchase peace, and for a moment it seemed the city might be spared. But money could not stop an army that had set its mind on Georgia itself. The Georgian force, thin and outnumbered, faced an enemy that was preparing to strike with a scale few in Tbilisi had ever seen. Around 5,000 Georgians stood in the path of an Iranian host that could afford to lose thousands and still keep moving. At first, the Georgians managed to slow the assault outside Tbilisi, fighting hard enough to make the attackers cautious. Scouts tried to read the battlefield, but the price was brutal. Nearly all the forward eyes were cut down. Even so, the defenders pulled off a dangerous maneuver, drawing Iranian units into the Kura Gorge, funneling them into a killing ground where artillery could matter. In that narrow space, Crown Prince David's guns smashed the leading ranks and turned the first rush into chaos. It was the kind of moment that can change a battle, but it demanded support and coordination that never fully arrived. Crown Prince Georgi, who held thousands of Kakhetian troops, did not commit his whole strength. Only part of his men joined the line, and the rest stayed back, leaving the defenders thinner than the situation required. The next phase came in fog and confusion. On the morning of September 11th, the Iranians realized the truth. The Georgian front was brave but small. Once that became clear, the attack shifted from probing to encirclement. From multiple directions, under cover of mist, the Iranian army pressed in. The Allied force from western Georgia collapsed at the worst moment. Of Solomon's several thousand Imeretians, only a few hundred stayed to fight. The rest scattered, stripping the field and then drifting back toward home with whatever they could carry. The battle became a disaster measured not only in casualties, but in the sudden absence of unity. The Iranians paid a heavy price in dead, but they could afford it. The Georgians could not. Thousands of Georgian fighters fell, including experienced commanders and the men who'd kept the artillery functioning. A highland detachment from the Aragvi region was wiped out. Erekle, already in old age, stayed in the saddle and fought at close range, cutting through infantry with a desperation that looked almost unreal to those watching. He survived only because his grandson Iwan pulled him out before the line broke entirely. By the end of that day, Tbilisi was burning. Many residents had fled earlier, and merchants had already loaded their goods onto carts and escaped while there was still time. Those left behind faced the worst possibilities. Large numbers were killed outright. Others were seized and driven away into captivity. The city was not merely defeated, it was stripped and violated. Churches and palaces were broken open and looted, sacred spaces profaned, and the symbols of kingship carried off. In a matter of days, a generation's attempt to rebuild civic life was erased. Schools and libraries disappeared into ash. The work that had gone into administration, military organization, printing, and public institutions was smashed so quickly that survivors later struggled to describe it as anything other than an ending. The violence did not stop at the city limits. Iranian forces pursued the remnants of Erekle's army northward into the Aragvi Valley. That chase ended only when a small band of Kevsur warriors, famed for ferocity and mountain fighting, threw themselves into the path of the pursuers and forced them back. Erekle tried to gather fresh highland fighters, begged Georgi again for even a modest reinforcement from Kakheti, and looked for a way to negotiate. But the Iranian leader had already returned to the ruined capital and, after gathering captives and spoil, marched away. On 21st September, the army withdrew, taking tens of thousands of prisoners. The kingdom had been broken, not simply beaten. Erekle's reaction was not theatrical, it was human. He sank into a silence that those around him mistook for physical illness. For a time he sat wrapped in an old sheepskin, facing a wall inside a highland refuge, refusing to speak or meet eyes. When he finally moved, he chose Tel Aviv and avoided Tbilisi, unable to bear the sight of his capital reduced to wreckage. Letters followed, and bitter and accusatory, aimed at Gudovich and the Russian command. The sense of betrayal was sharp because the promise of protection had been one of the few pillars holding Georgian strategy together. Now, that promise looked like a performance staged for diplomacy, not a shield meant for war. Russia's reputation suffered across the region. An Iranian warlord had reduced a kingdom tied to Russia by treaty to rubble within days. People who watched from the outside began to ask whether this outcome had been allowed on purpose. Some contemporaries, and many later commentators, suspected a deliberate abandonment, reasoning that a devastated ally is easier to control than a confident one. Whatever the intent, the effect was clear. Help arrived only when it no longer mattered. 2 Russian battalions crossed the Darial Pass months later, after the Iranian army had moved far away to deal with rebellion in the east. With little resistance remaining, Russian and Georgian troops advanced easily, reached toward the Caspian and retook Ganja. The campaign looked impressive on paper, but it was too late to save Tbilisi. Then the Russian court changed. Catherine died in late 1796, and her son Paul reversed course almost immediately. Policies were torn up, commanders received new instructions, and Erikli found himself abandoned again. Russian officers were told to treat him not as a partner, but as a convenient piece on a hostile board. Warnings from Georgian diplomats that the Iranian threat might return slowed the withdrawal for a short time, but the retreat came anyway. As Russian forces stepped back, Iranian power reasserted itself in the south, without meeting serious opposition. Erevan and Karabakh slipped away again. Only the murder of the Iranian Shah in 1797 prevented a second blow from landing immediately. His killer was an aide of Georgian origin who acted out of fear after being threatened with execution. That assassination created a window in which Erikli could recover fragments of what had been lost, but it did not change the structural problem. Russia resumed pulling out troops and money and demanded strict obedience to the very treaty it had failed to honour when the kingdom burned. The result was paralysis. Georgia was expected to obey restrictions on diplomacy and war-making. Yet, it was denied the support that had supposedly justified those restrictions. After 1795, Kartli-Kaketia ceased to function as a defensible state. Population loss was catastrophic. There were not enough peasants to feed an oversized aristocracy and a sprawling royal household, and certainly not enough to support an army capable of protecting the borders. Trade withered. Roads remained unsafe. Markets emptied. The crown's ability to collect revenue collapsed. On January 11th, 1798, Erikli died, exhausted by war, grief, and the slow realization that the protection he had chosen was conditional at best. His successor, Georgi XII, inherited ruin and division. He was chronically ill, weakened by gout, and lacked the energy and decisiveness needed to rebuild. Court observers described a ruler who gave only a small slice of each day to government and spent the rest in prayer, food, drink, and sleep. The stronger personalities around him became the real engines of intrigue. The Dowager Queen, Darajan, and Erikli's sons from his second marriage still had ambitions and loyalists. Yet they were pushed aside. Russia removed one of the most forceful princes to Russian territory, not as a reward, but as a leash, ensuring compliance through distance and dependency. In theory, recovery was still imaginable. A more effective king might have rebuilt authority, and if the succession had been clearer, the state might have regrouped. International circumstances were even shifting in a way that could have helped. By 1799, events in the Mediterranean were pushing Russia and Turkey toward accommodation. Under different leadership, the Western principalities and the strategic southern borderlands might have been drawn into a broader Georgian structure, creating a state large enough to survive. But that path required unity at the top, and unity did not exist. Georgi's main focus became succession itself. He worked to undo Erikli's earlier testament and secure recognition for his own son, David, as heir. The Russian Tsar accepted this alteration in 1799, but the decision enraged other members of the royal family and deepened fractures. Kartli split into camps. Those loyal to David, those loyal to Yulon, those among merchants and some urban groups who believed the monarchy had become a liability and wanted direct union with Russia, and those who wanted to break with Russia entirely and return to older alignments with Iran. Every faction believed it was choosing survival. Every faction weakened the state. Paul ended debate by sending troops and a political handler. In November 1799, a regiment entered Tbilisi with ceremony and noise. Cannon fired salutes. Bells rang. Crowds gathered in the streets and on rooftops. Women dressed in white-lining balconies to watch what many believed was a final deliverance from decades of raids. Villages competed to host soldiers. People spoke as if the long nightmare had ended. Few understood that the troops were not arriving as temporary guests. In western Georgia, the 1790s brought no peace either, even without a major foreign invasion on the scale of 1795. Solomon II fought constant internal battles against powerful rivals, including his former regent, David, Georgis, and the shifting leadership in Mingrelia. Hostages were taken. Bargaining conducted at dagger point, and families dragged into the conflict. David's wife, Anna, and their son, Constantine, became pawns. Constantine was held, and Anna escaped death only by running through forests toward Kartli, where Russian grenadiers saved her near Surami. She was sent north, and years passed before her son's release could even be negotiated. David died in exile in Akaltsike, but the struggle continued. Solomon replaced the Dadiani with a relative, and new claimants emerged, backed by different regional factions. Exhausted nobles began asking Russia to take the entire West, believing annexation might at least end the civil wars. Pro-Russian posture became a weapon. A deposed ruler presented himself as Russia's friend to gain protection from enemies at home and received honours that advertised Russian favour. In Guria, a determined regent used councils, threats, and executions to reshape the political landscape, targeting those who leaned toward the Ottomans and punishing slave traders with death. Russia's interest in the West was practical. Ports mattered. Ottoman garrisons still controlled key coastal points, and outsiders were shut out. Russia wanted access and leverage, but moved cautiously, wary of provoking Turkey too openly. It sent a discreet observer rather than a large force, measuring mood and opportunity. In Kartli, Russia gained fresh popularity late in 1800 after a joint action defeated Dagestani raiders. That success made Russian presence look like genuine security again. The Tsar sent a new senior commander, a large, friendly figure who behaved like the king's companion while quietly turning himself into the executive power behind the throne. Georgian advisors who demanded strict enforcement of the treaty's mutual obligations were marginalized. Georgi himself behaved less like a sovereign negotiating terms and more like a petitioner begging for subsidies, requesting people to repopulate lands, and asking for pensions and estates for troublesome relatives in Russia. The price he seemed willing to pay was humiliatingly small, a symbolic monarchy with real control elsewhere. In late December 1800, Georgi died suddenly. Accounts differed immediately. Some claimed he entrusted his country to Russia with his last breath. Others insisted that he demanded his son be crowned. What mattered was what Russia had prepared in advance. Without telling Georgian envoys, Paul had already drafted an order that would block any accession and place the kingdom under direct Russian administration. The plan depended on speed, and commanders on the ground hesitated only because they feared announcing abolition before reinforcements could cross the winter-closed mountain pass. A more aggressive officer acted first. The nobility was summoned to the cathedral and told that the king's final wish was submission to Russia. Georgian voices protested in the moment, insisting that the statement was being twisted to deny David his inheritance. Arrests followed. Warnings were sent west. In early January 1801, ambassadors returned from Russia and declared David king, but only subject to confirmation. David sent them back to obtain formal investiture. It did not matter. Annexation moved forward anyway. Within weeks, Kartli-Kaketia was treated as a Russian province. Orders circulated to remove the royal family quietly, especially the male princes, and to move many women as well. The number of Bagratids was large enough that the operation had to be planned like a security campaign. The symbols of monarchy were locked away. The widow kept only personal relics. Paul's own murder did not rescue Georgia. Alexander I continued the same policy. Some ministers questioned whether unilateral annexation was necessary or lawful, but the machinery was already moving. David was deposed without ever being crowned. Russian commanders took direct control. When enough troops arrived to guarantee order, a manifesto was read publicly, presenting annexation as a humanitarian duty rather than territorial ambition. Georgian envoys protested that their country was being stripped of dignity and demanded that locals, not Russians, administer the land. The response was ceremony, backed by bayonets. In the cathedral, surrounded by armed troops, nobles were compelled to swear allegiance before Easter services began. Resistance flared. Both dowager queens protested and dissident princes were arrested. Russian authorities laid out their program openly. Convert highland communities. Link strategic routes to Black Sea and Caspian targets. Settle newcomers, and make the province profitable enough to fund its own occupation. A new administrative structure appeared with multiple departments and police officials, courts reshaped, and separate arrangements for different ethnic communities. Russian became the language of administration, even though almost no one understood it. The old local legal code still applied in limited areas, but in practice authority shifted to officials who did not speak the country's language, and often did not respect its institutions. The first Russian administrators quickly became despised. Even by the standards of empire, their behavior was predatory. Markets were looted, princes insulted, women violated, punishments carried out with brutality. One official's arrogance toward Queen Darajan became a symbol of the new order, as did his corruption, currency schemes, and profiteering from state projects. Food prices rose, abuse spread. In 1802, St. Petersburg removed the most notorious figures and installed a new military governor, a Russified Georgian noble with deep knowledge of language and society, alongside a Georgian civil governor. Improvements followed in small ways. A school was founded, street cleaning ordered, public rules announced. Yet the deeper problem remained. Russia sent many of its worst bureaucrats to the region, and even a capable governor could not fully restrain them. When the mountain pass reopened in spring 1803, deportations began in earnest. The dowager queens refused invitations to travel north voluntarily. Russian commanders expected compliance anyway. Then a scene unfolded that became legend. Soldiers burst into Queen Mariam's bedroom and told her the carriage was waiting. She snatched a dagger and killed the officer leading the operation. A relative wounded another man. The response was immediate. Mariam was sent under guard deep into Russia, stripped of freedom and even simple objects that could be used as weapons. Darajan resisted longer, but she too was eventually deported. Princes were moved out one by one, sometimes with secrecy, sometimes with force. Attempts at sabotage followed. Bridges were damaged. Guerrilla bands formed in the hills. Some princes chose exile in Ottoman or Iranian territory and began decades of resistance from abroad. Others tried to force Russia to honour the treaty by insisting that a Bagratid should still be crowned. The dynasty's infighting weakened sympathy at home. Some royal figures served Russia loyally as officers. Others fought each other, tearing up lands belonging to rival camps. The merchant class resisted too, refusing to sell supplies below cost, manipulating exchange rates, and treating Russian money with open contempt. Russian officers privately insulted the local population in foreign language correspondence and struggled to grasp the economic reality. A peasantry that produced mainly for survival and a state whose revenues could not cover the costs of occupation, pensions, ransoms, and garrisons. New taxes were invented to fill the gap, including levies that targeted households in the capital. In Russia, exile quickly split the Bagratid family into two stories: adaptation and resentment. Many of them, once the shock of removal faded, learned to live inside the imperial system. Titles, salaries, uniforms, estates, and academic posts offered a substitute for crowns. A number of princes became senators or officers, others turned into landowners or bookish men who chased prestige through language, genealogy, and history. The former uncrowned king, David, tried to behave like a practical man of the new order. He sold off his properties in Tbilisi so they could be turned into government offices, as if converting the last pieces of a lost court into administrative stone might make the humiliation feel less personal. Yet he could not accept his downfall without searching for a culprit. He focused his anger on his wife, Helene, and pushed for a divorce through church authorities in Russia. The Georgian nobility, as a class, was handled with calculated generosity. Promotions, pensions, decorations, and ceremonial respect rewarded those who made peace with the new reality. Most importantly for them, their power over their own peasants remained intact. The empire absorbed local aristocrats the way it absorbed provinces, by leaving certain privileges untouched, while removing sovereignty. Georgian nobles took their place in the familiar provincial structure, including the election of a leader who represented their estate. The honour fell to a seasoned diplomat, a man who understood how to speak to the imperial court without openly begging. This kind of arrangement softened the nobility's panic. It created the feeling that status had survived, even if the state had not. At the top of the new administration, a hard-driving governor tried to steady the situation and make occupation look like governance. He offered gestures meant to restore civic life. A printing press that had been dismantled in the chaos of invasion was put back together. Pharmacies and postal services appeared. Police violence was curbed where possible, and local laws were ordered into translation so Russian judges would not rule blindly. These reforms were not romantic, they were functional. They aimed to prevent the province from collapsing into banditry and famine. Yet even as order returned to the streets, the borderlands remained a wound. Dagestani raiders still appeared in the outskirts of Tbilisi, taking hostages. Kurdish soldiers crossed from Ottoman territory to hunt Cossacks. The new rulers answered with punitive expeditions. Captured raiders were marched publicly through Georgian districts as trophies, and entire communities were fined or stripped of land. Key regions near the frontier were annexed, and rebel groups were cut off from outside support by pushing imperial control eastward toward the Caspian. In the capital, those advances could be celebrated as protection. In the countryside, they felt like the tightening of a fist. For Georgia's peasantry, the change of flag brought little relief, and in some places it brought fresh cruelty. The first major uprising did not begin in a palace or a church council, but on a road, near the vital passage over the mountains. Local people, protested requisitions of grain and meat taken by armed detachments. A police official answered their complaints with degradation rather than negotiation, using imprisonment and filth as punishment. Then the demands escalated. Villagers were forced to clear snow and rock from the highway in brutal conditions. Men were beaten until they died. Women were harnessed to loads like animals and struck to keep them moving. Workers vanished in avalanches. Draft animals were driven to exhaustion and dropped on the road. Outrage turned into violence. The Aragvi Valley rose, attacked troops and seized key points on the route. Rebels from different communities asked a royal fugitive to lead them, hoping his name would give their anger legitimacy. A battle followed on the heights. Highland fighters managed to trap Russian units in dangerous terrain, and the Russians were saved only by hesitation among local nobles and by the return of an experienced commander from another front. The aftermath was severe. Hundreds were killed with bayonets or dragged away in chains. The lesson was delivered clearly. The empire could absorb protest, but it would not tolerate armed refusal. After that, open rebellion quieted for a time, though hatred did not. News of Kartli-Kaketia's fate shook western Georgia. Solomon II of Imereti had once looked to Russia as a counterweight to Ottoman pressure and internal rivals. Now he saw what protection could become. His closest political mind urged him not to yield ground without iron guarantees. When Russian commanders accused Imereti of sheltering rebellious princes, Solomon answered in the language of custom rather than ideology. Hospitality to relatives could not be denied, yet he claimed he would encourage peace with the imperial court. Behind this careful phrasing stood a harder position. Russian oversight would be acceptable only if Solomon's dynasty was preserved, if nearby principalities remained subordinate to his crown, and if key ports and trade routes were not taken out of his hands. It was a bargaining stance built on one belief. A king could survive as a client, but not as a decorative prisoner. Russia tested Imereti with pressure disguised as procedure. A hostage prince, long held in miserable conditions, was released after prolonged negotiation. He was sent to Tbilisi, dressed and mounted like a restored noble. A calculated display meant to show that mercy flowed from the empire. Then the tone changed. A Russian army entered Imereti under the excuse of opening roads to allied vassals on the coast. Solomon was informed that he must obey military orders, serve Russian interests, and accept terms similar to those imposed in the east. Promises were floated about restoring disputed territories as a reward. At the same time, assurances were quietly given to Solomon's rivals that no such restoration would truly undermine them. Practical problems slowed immediate annexation. Turkish objections mattered. Supply mattered even more. The countryside could offer little beyond millet, and Russian soldiers despised it, treating the land as incapable of feeding an army. Still, the direction was obvious. Guria leaned toward Russia, and Solomon found himself encircled by neighbours who were either Russian clients or eager to become them. Solomon reacted the way a threatened king often reacts, by looking for leverage everywhere at once. He complained to Ottoman authorities, negotiated with regional khans, and struck at nearby principalities to seize hostages. He demanded money he claimed was owed from earlier alliances and tried to block Russian troops from entering his capital. His behaviour grew sharper and more reckless. Envoys were mistreated, and violence became a political tool. Russian officials began to speak of him not as a partner, but as a problem that had to be removed. They also searched for hidden influences, convinced that the king was being guided by an outsider with a taste for intrigue. In western Georgia there was, indeed, a foreign priest whose presence blended medicine, religion, and politics into one unsettling figure. He was a rare trained doctor in a region where illness killed more reliably than bullets, and that alone made him powerful. He treated leading families and was rewarded generously, even with villagers. But he also involved himself in succession disputes and regional alliances with an energy that alarmed both church superiors and Russian commanders. When a prominent ruler died after a bout of sickness, rumours of poisoning spread instantly. Letters appeared suggesting that only the widow and the priest had been trusted with medicines and food. The priest was seized through a crude trap and interrogated for months. The widow later offered a different explanation, describing a pattern of illness brought on by excess eating and a fatal mistake with the wrong drug. Despite the contradictions, the priest's removal served a political purpose. Even after he regained freedom and returned to the coast to collect debts from patients, the stigma remained, and Russian authorities continued to treat him as a disruptive operator rather than a clergyman. Along the Black Sea, Russia's strategy hardened into something more than managing princes. Abkhazia became a proving ground. Its leaders played Turkey and Russia against one another, shifting promises with the wind. Hostages, raids, and family feuds shaped politics as much as diplomacy. Russia offered salaries and ranks to princes, tried ultimatums, used gunboats, and seized forts. When a local strongman was murdered, the blame was assigned in ways that suited the moment, and a rival candidate was pushed forward as a new ruler under Russian support. The installation was met with violent resistance. Russian ships stormed the coastal stronghold, hundreds died, and thousands fled across the sea into Ottoman lands. A new leader took power under Russian protection, while a rival continued to stir rebellion from the mountains for years. The coast was being rearranged, not only by treaties, but by fear, exile, and naval fire. For the imperial court, these punishments and palace dramas mattered less than one practical objective: securing a port that could connect Georgia to the wider empire by sea. The route from Odessa to the Black Sea coast, then inland along rivers toward Kartli, promised speed and supply without dependence on mountain passes. Yet the key port remained blocked by an Ottoman garrison unwilling to cooperate, even for bribes. Russia used a smaller nearby landing place instead and tried to reshape it into a working base. Officers surveyed swamps for canals and routes, wading through malarial ground that sickened soldiers and frightened locals. Even where coastal rulers welcomed Russia, ordinary people watched troops with anxiety, sensing that protection always arrived with requisitions and new rules. International politics complicated everything. A Russian defeat in Central Europe emboldened Turkey and Iran and invited foreign intrigue in the Caucasus. Diplomats in Europe listened to reports claiming Georgians were disgusted with Russian administration and eager to throw off another yoke. Plans were drafted abroad that treated Georgia as a bargaining chip, a territory to be promised to Iran in exchange for alliances against Russia. Those plans shifted and collapsed as European powers changed partners, signed new treaties, and abandoned yesterday's commitments. Even so, the idea of foreign liberation lingered in the imagination of exiled princes. Some clung to the hope that a Western conqueror might one day march across the region and restore Georgian kingship as a political gesture. While courts plotted, the war on the ground continued. Dagestani and Lezgi forces struck Kakhtia. From Akaltsike, Ottoman warfare remained half-hearted, but it still bled the borderlands. Russian-Georgian armies raided and counter-raided, taking forts and contesting rivers. A small Russian force faced an enormous Iranian army in Karabakh, a land deliberately stripped into desert to starve invaders. The Russians held their ground, but during negotiations an assassination ended the career of the most forceful imperial governor. His death did not stop Russia's advance. The army pushed on, and within a year large stretches of land between Georgia and the Caspian were absorbed into imperial control. His successor lacked the same grip. Administration thinned, civil officials died of fevers or went bankrupt. Revolt simmered in the highlands. Roads remained dangerous, sometimes passable only under escort. Even when taxes were reduced and customs fees abolished, resentment did not dissolve. Education expanded, but priorities were reshuffled in ways that revealed the empire's mindset. Practical discipline mattered more than classical learning, and teachers could be reassigned like clerks. Surveillance grew. Arrests multiplied. Networks of dissidents were hunted even beyond Georgia's borders. Immeritia, meanwhile, became darker. Solomon II complained that drunken soldiers desecrated his palace and that his advisor had been seized. A boycott was organized to starve the occupying forces, relying on the simple logic that armies cannot live on promises. Rival claimants feared execution and sought rescue from Russian officers. The king became increasingly isolated. Russian commanders began to speak of him with contempt, calling him unworthy of a royal title. Orders were issued in foreign languages to prevent interception. Printing presses were brought in, not for learning but for proclamations. Solomon was accused of negotiating with Turkey, Iran, and Dagestan, and of plotting to seize Tbilisi and unify Georgia under his own rule with outside help. Whether these plans were realistic mattered less than the fact that they were imaginable. From that point, Solomon was no longer a king in negotiation, but a target in a campaign. Control of the coast advanced again when Russian forces seized the key port. Local allies, assisted by slaughtering Ottoman troops, sent to reinforce positions, leaving the shoreline open for Russian ships. With Abkhazia under a Russian-backed ruler, the maritime connection from the Crimea to Georgia became workable. A new commander arrived in the Caucasus and ruled with speed and severity. He dismantled layers of bureaucracy, made decisions instantly, deported petitioners who annoyed him, and favoured swift punishment over formal trials. Officials wore swords, while Georgian princes were forbidden to carry weapons. Nobles were ordered to compile genealogies to prove their status. Yet this same man could be charitable in personal ways, helping orphaned students, forcing drunk teachers into rehabilitation, opening a seminary, and imposing building regulations so houses had proper foundations and sanitation. He granted asylum to immigrants, fleeing Ottoman lands, and encouraged printing for church use. Order and brutality travelled together. His obsession, however, was the remaining Bagratids. One prince had even turned Muslim and joined rebels in the mountains, moving between shelters and using hunger and terrain as defences. Attempts were made to lure him out with gifts, to arrest his hosts, and to negotiate through relatives. The prince answered with cruelty, torturing an envoy and selling him into captivity. Rewards were offered for capture. He was eventually killed by raiders, not by Russian troops, a reminder of how chaotic the region remained even under occupation. Another prince, more dangerous and more elusive, kept slipping between Dagestan and Iran, recruiting fighters and evading pursuit. Not all Bagratids chose resistance. One crown prince left Iran for St. Petersburg and reinvented himself as a scholar, moving into languages and history, training future researchers, and leaving politics behind. In the cultural world, another royal figure gained fame for writing that blended invention and encyclopedia, a strange literature born from a dynasty that had lost its state and turned inward. The empire then moved against the Georgian church. A leading church prince was offered a pension and removed to Russia. After his departure, the Georgian church was placed firmly under Russian religious authority. Services in the main cathedral were sung in Russian. Choir schools trained voices to match new standards. Church treasures were melted down, and icons were altered or whitewashed when they did not fit imperial taste. Dioceses were merged and reduced. This stung deeply because other religious communities within the province kept their autonomy. The message seemed unmistakable. Political annexation was being reinforced by ecclesiastical absorption. Iberia responded with a surge of loyalty to Solomon II. Persecution turned him into a symbol. He gathered thousands of men, moved through forests, hid in mountain gorges, and refused to surrender. Envoys tried to trap him with negotiations, but neither side would grant the guarantees the other demanded. Russian commanders made the nobility swear allegiance and gave the king an ultimatum. Quiet midnight meetings took place. Dinners shared with advisors, offers floated and withdrawn. Then Russian troops struck. Solomon was formally deposed and hunted. In a feat of harsh mountain pursuit, he was trapped near a gorge before he could escape toward Ottoman territory. He was taken to Tbilisi and placed under house arrest, with surveillance designed to be strict but not humiliating. A month later, he escaped anyway, in a scene that embarrassed the administration across the Caucasus. Disguised and moving at night, he passed a sentry while a servant lay in his bed as a decoy. Horses waited beyond the city boundary. A small band rode hard toward Akhaltsika, slipping past guards who were too drunk to be diligent. The reaction was immediate and harsh. Officials were dismissed. Search parties were sent. Solomon's relatives were arrested, including his queen and close family, and they were moved to unhealthy places where fever could finish what politics began. The Tsar took the escape as an insult, especially because Solomon left behind a high decoration he'd been awarded, as if rejecting the empire's attempt to purchase obedience with honours. Courts martial followed. Sentences were savage, some punishments were softened later, but others were carried out publicly to make an example. Executions were staged before crowds on the riverbank, a theatre of discipline meant to warn every would-be helper. In Akhaltsika, Solomon reorganized his resistance. He spoke with relatives and advisors and appealed in every direction, from Istanbul to Iran and even to Europe, presenting himself as a wronged monarch, seeking arbitration from the great powers. He conferred with the rebellious Georgian prince operating from Iran, and together they alternated between negotiation and raiding, offering to serve Russia if allowed to rule, then launching incursions when refusal came. Russia, fighting Turkey and Iran, found this activity intolerable. Yet Solomon hesitated to rely openly on Turkish troops, fearing that using foreign soldiers would turn his own people against him. Still, the rebellion spread. Russian forces suffered humiliations in rugged terrain, and the occupation's only true hostages were the relatives of key advisors. Pressure was applied through family, surveillance, confiscations, and threats. The struggle dragged Iberia into catastrophe. Bad harvests, blockades, and warfare produced famine on a scale that felt apocalyptic. Tens of thousands died in a single year. Abkhazia suffered mass hunger as well. Disease arrived with the opening of the Ottoman border zones, as it so often did, and plague cut through populations with terrifying speed. Soldiers and civilians fell together. Refugees streamed eastward, and city streets filled with the dying. In Kartli and Kakhetiya, some people supported the war because it promised recovery of lands long lost. In Tbilisi, many were disturbed by the sight of Western Georgians collapsing in the streets. The military governor, unmoved, framed the suffering as divine punishment for treachery. Administrative reforms continued anyway. Temporary government structures were imposed, old laws annulled, new courts introduced, and punishments applied to slave trading. As older economic patterns were disrupted, landholders found new ways to exploit peasants, mortgaging people instead of selling them outright. Plans were drawn for exploiting forests for shipbuilding. Schools were pushed on the clergy, and Russian moral manuals were distributed like tools for reshaping society. Even while thousands searched for Solomon, the administration shifted to taxation, announcing that the province was pacified enough to pay. Complaints about food prices were dismissed. Attempts to import grain from Russia started too late, and autumn storms made the sea impassable. Money was allocated instead, but money could not create grain in a blockaded landscape. The stubborn pursuit of one fugitive king was draining troops from other fronts and turning the western province into an expensive wound. The Tsar's patience thinned. The governor was replaced, and new leaders arrived with different styles. One was urbane and reform-minded. Another fought the Western crisis, while the first tried to clean up abuses in Tbilisi. They did not even share fluent Russian and worked through rough French, but they were less rigid and more pragmatic. These new administrators tolerated institutions that earlier governors treated as enemies, including Catholic missions that also served as the region's only reliable medical network. They organized parishes and stipends, trying to keep doctors where disease was constant. They argued that hunting Solomon and the exiled prince endlessly only inflated their stature. Better to stabilize trade, collect taxes, and build administrative capacity than to chase legends through forests. Requisitions were managed, prisons and arsenals planned, courts and police structures expanded, and civil servants were imported from other provinces. Efforts were made to grow the class of free peasants and traders, hoping that economic life would do what bayonets could not. Yet plague still returned, shutting schools as parents fled with children. Wheat prices rose as hunger spread from the west. Experiments were attempted, distributing new seed, searching for craftsmen who could manufacture glass so wine might be bottled and sold more widely, trying to turn subsistence agriculture into export. The administration also continued to deal with unruly members of the royal family, using monasteries as prisons and removing compromised clergy when corruption became too visible. Even royal graves were repurposed for imperial narrative, with monuments rewritten to claim that kings had willingly surrendered their country. In the west, despair persisted. Fever and malaria raged. Thousands fled into Ottoman zones, simply to survive. Reports sent north grew blunt. The province was small, costly, and hard to govern, with impassable terrain and a hostile neighbourhood across the border. Authorities looked for practical agricultural solutions that could keep people alive and feed garrisons. Over time, maize cultivation expanded and began to replace older grains in the coastal regions, eventually feeding households, soldiers, and even creating a modest surplus for trade. It was not a heroic fix, but it was the kind of change empires prefer. Quiet, measurable, and useful. The conquest had begun with manifestos and salutes. It continued with prisons, roadwork, forced oaths, and hunger. In the end, it was also shaped by seeds and fields, because surviving the new order required food as much as it required obedience. Paolucci's real test was never paperwork or ceremonies. It was the problem that sits underneath every occupation. How to keep a country quiet when people are hungry, sick, and convinced they are being robbed. After the famine and the wave of disease, grain became expensive in Kakheti. Yet the army still demanded wheat and barley at a token price. Officials offered a small payment for each cartload, far below what farmers could get in the market. Villagers refused to sell. It was a simple strike, the only leverage peasants had. The response was brutal and immediate. Soldiers seized the grain anyway. Violence followed in the homes as well as the granaries, leaving a trail of outrage that turned an economic dispute into a political explosion. The first spark flared in winter. A punitive detachment sent to enforce obedience was driven off in Akhmeta, and the rebellion spread so fast it looked like it had been waiting for permission. Towns across Kakheti were taken. Telavi and Signagi fell into rebel hands. Local noblemen, cautious and divided, hesitated to commit themselves, but the movement no longer depended on their decisions. It pushed into the mountains, where resentment had been simmering for years. Even the great road through the high passes came under threat. Armed Highlanders gathered in large numbers, rallied by a mysterious figure whose name carried the smell of shrine and legend rather than court politics. Paulucci rushed back from the eastern frontier, where he had been dealing with threats beyond the Caspian, and found a province sliding out of control. By early spring, the revolt had reached a symbolic point. Thousands of insurgents killed senior officers and proclaimed a new king, trying to bring the old language of monarchy back to life as a banner for resistance. For Paulucci, that made the crisis clearer. It could no longer be treated as banditry or a local riot. He struck hard, broke the rebel forces and made an example of leaders through public executions. Then, once the immediate danger was contained, he changed tactics. The most hated local officials were removed. Grain seizures were restricted. A formal inquiry into violence and abuse was announced, framed as a cleansing of the administration rather than a surrender to rebels. It did not end armed resistance overnight. Guerrillas remained in the forests, but the campaign allowed Paulucci to leave the scene with the appearance of restored authority, an official triumph built on both repression and limited reform. When Rtishchov replaced him, the timing could not have been worse. France was marching into Russia and Iran was pushing into the Caucasus. Rebels in Kakheti believed the empire would be overstretched and distracted. Some nobles decided the moment had come to gamble on a royal restoration. They sent envoys south to bring back Crown Prince Alexandre and crown him. Rtishchov did not have Paulucci's instinct for bargaining and stagecraft. He shut down the investigative body that had at least promised accountability, but tried another approach. Generals were sent to offer amnesty to rebels who laid down arms. The offer came too late to calm the fever and too early to be backed by clear strength. Alexandre returned with a small band, claiming a larger Persian force was close behind him. As Moscow burned far away, rebel groups cut the main military road, making the northern connection unstable again. Alexandre's men tried to isolate Tbilisi and keep an escape route open toward the mountains. He had fast cavalry that terrified infantry and a better intelligence network than his opponents expected. Yet he lacked what mattered most in set-piece fighting: artillery. In September, he won a battle at Shilda against a Georgian general serving Russia, only to lose the advantage when reinforcements arrived at the critical moment. The conflict swung back and forth, driven by speed, rumour, and the psychology of a population that had lived through decades of raiding and punishment. By October, imperial forces regained the upper hand. A Persian column sent in support was crushed, and Alexandre's position weakened rapidly. Georgian backing began to evaporate. His allied fighters from the north drifted away, calculating that the risk was no longer worth it. Only the highland communities fought on with the stubbornness of people who had little to lose. The counterattack that followed was merciless. Fortified villages were destroyed. Entire settlements were burned. In one campaign, hundreds of mountain fighters were killed and strongholds were reduced to rubble. Alexandra slipped away into Dagestan, leaving behind prisoners who faced execution or forced labour far from home. Ertishchov governed the aftermath through fear. Rebel villages were torched along with their vineyards and fields, designed to make survival itself a punishment. Thousands were killed or driven from their homes. Trials were held by military courts. Clergy were arrested alongside nobles. Some were locked away. Others sent to distant labour camps. Public hangings returned, including the execution of elderly villagers, chosen to underline that age offered no protection. The province was forced to pay massive fines in silver and grain, and the effect was predictable. Hunger deepened, resentment hardened, and collective responsibility became law. Theft and resistance were met with flogging. Military authority replaced civil rhythm. Even inside this harsh system, a few local figures were treated as useful exceptions. Certain priests and tough-minded community leaders were trusted with weapons or resources because they were seen as effective against raiders. They could rally people quickly and they were paid for loyalty. The empire preferred such men because they offered results without requiring trust in the broader population. Ertishchov then spent years trying to solve the one problem that would not burn away: Crown Prince Alexandre. Negotiations dragged on, alternating between threats and promises. Rewards were offered to regional rulers in exchange for Alexandre, dead or alive. Alexandre understood too well what surrender could mean and surrounded himself with bodyguards from the northern mountains. Both sides relied on intermediaries. They disliked and distrusted. The imperial governor even tried to bargain with Iranian leadership, floating the idea that Alexandre could be handed over if he were kept under tight control. For a moment, it looked as if he might come down from the mountains and surrender. Instead, he prepared a bolder escape. In 1818, moving with a tiny retinue, chatting casually with border guards as if he belonged there, he crossed into Ottoman territory and then made his way back to Iran. The embarrassment was severe, and the officer responsible was punished harshly. The empire wanted the message to travel faster than the prince had. Meanwhile, the wider map shifted again. A peace with the Ottomans forced Russia to return some captured places, keeping only what it could justify through diplomacy and local leverage. On the coast, one port became firmly Russian as local rulers aligned with the empire. Western Georgia's exiled king, Solomon II, lost his remaining usefulness to Ottoman policy once the border stabilized. He remained in Anatolia, weakened and isolated, and died in Trabzon in 1815. After his death, an agreement was made to allow his body to be returned for burial in the royal mausoleum, and members of his household were permitted to go home. His widow and close female relatives lived comfortably in St. Petersburg, a reminder that the empire could be generous once a threat had ceased to exist. In Imeretia itself, ordinary life did not brighten. The best-intentioned Russian administrator died suddenly, and the region remained poor, with one unhealthy coastal outlet and little commerce. Food shortages continued. Church governance was tightened under imperial religious authority, and administration remained clumsy and punitive. Authorities lashed out at financial practices they disliked, whipping lenders and sending families away as a warning, yet slavery and trafficking did not disappear. Decrees multiplied, requiring witnesses and paperwork, but the underlying misery created new ways to exploit the weak. Ertishchov tried to fight robbery by turning landowners into responsible parties, forcing them to compensate victims of theft on their land. He attempted to run justice personally, hearing petitions on set days and issuing decisions quickly. He demanded genealogies to curb false claims of nobility. He also struggled with money itself. Small coinage was minted but lacked base metal. New supplies had to be imported. Paper banknotes were introduced, but people disliked them because they were worth far less than their printed value in daily trade. These measures made governance look modern, while leaving villagers feeling squeezed from every side. Tishchov resigned in 1816, praising his own legacy in the usual official tone. But his failures were obvious. One of his most costly experiments had been building a new port site near Poti, where thousands of soldiers died of fever before the place was abandoned. His replacement was Ermolov, a commander who believed that order was created by force and maintained by fear. He had wanted the post for years and approached it like a personal mission. He purged false nobles, began reshaping local law into a form imperial courts could use, demanded huge subsidies from the centre, and treated the church primarily as a property problem to be managed. He rebuilt the main mountain highway so that spring floods and rockfalls would no longer sever the province from Russia. He surveyed new roads to bind east and west together. To fight depopulation and stagnation, Ermolov imported German Protestant farmers from Württemberg and settled them near Tbilisi. These colonists arrived with their own beliefs and discipline, hoping for a religious destiny of their own, and were expected to teach local peasants better farming and dairy methods. They did improve supply in certain areas, bringing new foods and crafts into the capital's markets. At the same time, they clashed with local realities, struggled with harsh winters, and became targets for raids. Their families sometimes had to be ransomed after attacks. Still, their numbers grew, and more settlers followed because the empire valued any population that could produce reliably and remain loyal. Ermolov raised taxes in Tbilisi, judging that the city could bear a heavier burden. He criticized aristocratic exploitation of peasants, pointing to the endless obligations villagers carried. Not just rent and tithes, but the costs of their lords' celebrations, funerals, hospitality, and seasonal gifts, plus labour, horses, and even wet nurses. He tried to address labour shortages with state grants for officials and interpreters, recruited from other parts of the empire. He supported production of dye and silk thread, subsidizing European-style mills and craftsmen, and reorganized merchants into guild-like structures with tax exemptions and protected caravans. Foreign experts were invited to improve winemaking, though the lack of glass for bottles blocked wider export. Elite schooling expanded in the capital, creating a larger class of educated youth suited for bureaucratic service. Yet many plans collapsed in practice. Colonists resisted authority and shocked conservative observers with their social habits. Roads in the west remained weak, ports handled only a trickle of ships, and supplies moved inland mainly to feed soldiers rather than to revive local commerce. Almost no money circulated in rural Imeretiya. Taxes rose, especially on church-bound peasants, and even villages once exempt for extreme poverty were now forced to pay. Travellers described deserted settlements still hollowed out by disease, and a ruined Kutaisi where the most active institutions were foreign missions caring for the sick. Raids from the Ottoman side continued, with kidnappings and ransom becoming part of the landscape. Loyal local rulers played double games, corresponding with Russia's enemies while presenting obedience to Russian commanders. Weapon supplies were reported crossing mountain routes. The region was heating again. By 1819 and 1820, armed revolt erupted in Racha and then spread wider. Officials fled. Russian commanders panicked and called for reinforcements. Local noble families pushed rival candidates for leadership, some naming a new king, others insisting that Crown Prince Alexandre should be brought back from Persia. The empire answered with a mix of retreat and steel. Certain church policies were rolled back to calm anger, and an unpopular religious official was removed. Yet in the same breath, oaths of loyalty were demanded, and repentance was required. Kutaisi was fortified. A civil war broke out among the nobility itself, splitting families into pro-Russian and rebel camps. Bishops who tried to mediate were seized and deported, one dying on the journey, a warning that even the church could be treated as a battlefield. In Guria, the uprising took a dramatic turn. A Russian officer, authorized to destroy resistance but pretending to conduct harmless surveys, tried to force the regent to surrender a fugitive claimant. A gesture of humiliation with a whip ignited murder. The officer was killed and his entourage taken hostage. Another column retreated rather than walk into ambushes. The imperial command branded the regent a traitor and promised terror. Hostages were seized from rival dynasties to prevent new claimants from becoming symbols. Large battles followed near monasteries and on river crossings. Rebels attacked the coastal fortifications and threatened the imperial supply route. Some local rulers proved loyalty by handing over their own relatives to Russian punishment. Russian commanders responded by burning villages, destroying orchards and vineyards, and hanging captives on the spot. When the murderer was produced, he was killed publicly in a ritualized ordeal meant to impress fear into the crowd. By autumn, rebel leaders fled into Ottoman territory, and many suspected collaborators were rounded up and sent away, to die in distant exile. The empire's logic was simple. Poverty itself would become the sentence. By 1821, the final pressure returned in full force. Western Georgia was crushed again. A few exiles managed to come back, only to be sent away once more. The region's economic hopes faded. Plans for timber exports and transit trade were blocked or abandoned. Sea traffic dwindled further. The dream that Georgia would serve as a great corridor for goods between Europe and Persia weakened as routes shifted elsewhere and foreign shipping concentrated on Ottoman ports. Local princely houses survived in reduced form, sometimes with family members in Siberia, sometimes with mothers in Russia, sometimes with fugitives beyond reach. In Guria, a young prince inherited a title inside what was essentially a military district, supervised by Russian power. Ermolov could not build the roads and bridges needed to knit the country together, and he struggled to force the economy into the shape he imagined. Merchants in Tbilisi defended their control of the retail market and resisted foreign competition. Agricultural schemes for cotton, indigo, and tobacco remained ink on paper. Foreign proposals to import artisans and transform silk production stalled on money, politics, and the sheer difficulty of forcing long-term investment into a land still shaking from revolt. Yet the capital did change in visible ways. Foreign traders, many of them British, treated Tbilisi as a transit point between Ottoman lands and Iran. European restaurants and bakeries appeared. Gardens once reserved for the elite were open to polite society. The ruins left from earlier catastrophes were finally cleared, giving the city a cleaner face even as its deeper wounds remained. Ermolov's last major struggle inside Georgia was with the Ossetians over taxation. In the end, they received a special arrangement that spared them some of the harshest obligations imposed on Georgian peasants. Not long after, in 1826, Abbas Mirza struck again without a formal declaration of war and pushed into Transcaucasia. Ermolov judged that he lacked the means for an effective counterattack and abandoned Ganja. The new Tsar considered the retreat unforgivable. Ermolov was removed and replaced by Paskevich, who quickly proved his military value by driving the Persians out later that year. Paskevich was no philosopher and no gentle administrator, but he was effective. His victories against Iran brought Armenia and Azerbaijan firmly into the imperial system. And his later war with Turkey restored a Kaltsika and secured Black Sea ports in a way that mattered directly for Georgia's geography and security. Under his rule, Abkhazia and Svanetia were drawn more fully under Russian control. In practical terms, the empire had completed the reintegration of Georgian lands under one umbrella, though that umbrella was imperial, not royal. Unexpectedly, Paskevich also pushed civic improvements. Plans were drawn for hospitals, libraries, orphanages, and shelters, and church lands were taken to fund them. A proper water supply and a wholesale market were discussed. Post stations multiplied. New prisons were planned, though money and corruption delayed much of it for years. The city still suffered from basic shortages, and prisoners died in improvised dungeons because the system could not build fast enough. Some European-style buildings rose through forced labour, but even that effort was cut short by death and illness among officials. Education expanded again. Elite schooling became closer to a true grammar school. New schools opened in other towns, including the first serious efforts at educating girls and training craftsmen among crowned serfs. Workshops, sawmills, and mills were installed and apprentices trained. Clerks were imported as administrative workers. Coinage was produced more reliably. Paskevich sometimes overruled discriminatory orders when they collided with practical need, keeping skilled workers in the city because a capital without tailors and taverns cannot function. At the same time, exclusion still shaped life for minority communities. Taxes were demanded, but full benefits of the state were not shared equally. The machinery of empire could modernize a city while leaving entire groups on the margins by design. For centuries, Jewish communities in Georgia had lived with a kind of familiarity that was rare elsewhere. They looked and sounded like their neighbours. Their everyday clothing did not mark them out. Their Georgian was the Georgian of the street and the market, even if prayers and private expressions carried traces of Hebrew. Family names often blended into the same endings heard across the country, so that a stranger could pass a Jewish household without noticing anything different at all. They built sturdy synagogues openly and faced little resistance for doing so. They owned land, appeared as witnesses in legal matters, and in disputes among themselves they could often rely on their own religious law being respected. The old kingdoms had drawn one sharp line. Full entry into the privileged status of freemen required baptism. Yet even that boundary did not always carry the social poison that would be expected in other parts of Europe. People might know what a surname meant, but it did not automatically turn into a public brand. That long pattern began to crack in the 19th century. Hostility that had not been a defining feature of Georgian life suddenly appeared, and it did not arrive by accident. It came through the habits of empire. Imported regulations, imported prejudices, imported ways of sorting people into categories that mattered on paper and soon mattered on the street. By the late 1810s and again later in the 1820s, violence against Jews broke out. It was not simply a spontaneous outburst of local anger. It was the kind of change that happens when a new administration teaches society, quietly and repeatedly, that certain people are different and therefore fair targets when hardship bites. At the same time, the imperial system pushed another kind of transformation, the creation of a public voice in Russian. A state-supported newspaper appeared in Tbilisi, written for an empire at war and for officials who wanted the story told in the right tone. Campaigns against Persia were covered with the expected loyalty. Sensitive reports were handled with caution and information was sometimes filtered depending on the audience. This was not only journalism, it was messaging, a way to shape what people thought was happening in their name and what kinds of sacrifices were normal. The new administration also faced a legal maze that few governors could master without simply forcing their way through it. local traditions, imperial law, and the customs of Muslim communities all overlapped. Some officials tried to cut through the confusion by declaring rules and moving on. Others attempted a more pragmatic approach, carving out exceptions when necessity demanded it. Tax relief was granted to those ravaged by disease. Some communities guarding strategic roads were spared certain burdens. Areas damaged by troop movements received exemptions. Nomadic groups were treated differently, and key coastal settlements were handled with special caution because ports, even poor ones, mattered politically. Under Paskevich, the region was also pushed outward. Connections with Europe were encouraged, not out of sentimental admiration, but because Europe meant money, machinery, prestige, and leverage. Merchants travelled to major fairs. Goods moved along river and sea routes toward western Georgia. Yet the imbalance was obvious. Georgia did not suddenly become an industrial exporter. Its manufactured exports remained small, and the real economic change came from population movement and new territory. The acquisition of Akaltsike pulled thousands of Armenian families into the imperial economy, expanding labour, trade networks, and tax base in ways that mattered more than any single factory. Paskevich promoted practical projects as well as symbolic ones. A bottle factory was built so that local wine could be shipped and sold in a more modern way, and so the empire could reduce its dependence on expensive imports. Model farms were established to demonstrate European methods. Plans were floated for steamships and for a commercial bank, as if modern infrastructure could be summoned into existence by decree. In gardens and laboratories, his curiosity turned into policy. Tbilisi's botanical collection was expanded with species ordered from abroad, chosen not only for beauty but for imagined economic benefit. New plants arrived alongside ornamental trees, and among them were crops that would later shape everyday life and trade. Not all of these experiments flourished, but the ambition mattered. The region was being treated as a place that could be engineered into productivity. Many plans failed for reasons that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with human survival. Peasants did not reliably produce surplus. They grew enough to live and enough to meet demands, then stopped. German colonies struggled after invasions and epidemics, and were forced to consolidate rather than expand. Foreign experts arrived with confident reports and sometimes died before they could see the first seed sprout. One French surveyor looked at swampy western lowlands and imagined large-scale drainage and citrus groves like those found across the border. He believed fever could be beaten with medicine and clearance. He submitted his recommendations and then succumbed to the same climate that had killed so many before him. In this landscape, even a good plan could be buried with the planner. On religion, Paskevich often chose tolerance when it suited stability. He did not make a crusade out of converting Muslim communities in the mountains, and he defended the right of highlanders to keep their shrines. Yet he could still act like a conqueror when symbolism mattered, converting a prominent mosque into a church and renaming it as an imperial monument. His personal attitude toward ethnicity was pragmatic rather than ideological. He could praise locals as more reliable than outsiders, not because he was a romantic, but because he measured theft, bribery, and competence by experience. Cultural life also intersected with power in unexpected ways. A famous writer and diplomat killed violently abroad was buried in Tbilisi by the wishes of his widow, tying the imperial story to the Georgian landscape. A celebrated poet was allowed to accompany an army into Ottoman lands, despite police suspicion in the capital. The Caucasus, once treated as a distant frontier, had become a stage where reputations, literature, and politics mixed. Inspectors sent from the centre eventually arrived to look for disorder, and they found plenty. Corruption, idleness, and the constant improvisation that happens when the state's reach is longer than its capacity. Even so, the inspectors struggled to accuse Paskovich of much beyond rough methods and missing paperwork. In one infamous case, a captured courier was executed quickly and publicly, without the formalities that a modern bureaucracy claimed to value. It was a reminder that imperial order could be both legalistic and lawless, depending on what the moment demanded. The Caucasus then lost Paskovich the way it often lost its most capable administrators: promotion elsewhere. When Poland rose in rebellion, the empire reached for a man who could fight and govern at the same time. He was sent west, and the Caucasus waited months for a replacement. Eventually, Baron Rosen arrived, not merely with a portfolio, but with a family, a devout household, and the quiet confidence of a man personally trusted by the throne. He tried to rule with a human touch. In the burning heat of Tbilisi, he would check on sentries himself, loosening their uniforms with his own hands. That small gesture mattered in a city used to being ordered about by strangers. Rosen inherited the same swamp of petitions and grievances. Some were predictable, false claims to noble status that required elaborate proof, because titles meant privileges and privileges meant survival. Others were more emotional and dangerous, protests from royal descendants whose rank had been downgraded and from clergy who saw their bishops living comfortably while parish life starved. The administration lived in half-ruined buildings, staffed by officials weakened by fever or rotten with corruption. Every policy announcement produced a new wave of requests, complaints, and accusations. Rosen attempted popularity by broadening the official voice. The state newspaper appeared in multiple local languages, aimed at reaching Muslim readers as well as Christian ones. With the Ottoman and Persian fronts quieter for a time, recovery began in a slow, uneven way. The burdens on serfs were adjusted closer to what existed elsewhere in the empire. Some returning prisoners were freed, a policy that created grateful families and also created new expectations. Limited immigration was allowed. Currency was standardized, and Russian coins replaced the older mixture of local and foreign money that had been circulating side by side. Weights and measures were also unified, another quiet revolution because it changed trade, contracts, and daily bargaining. Sugar refining began, tobacco and maize cultivation expanded, and western forests were cut for timber and fuel. But industrial dreams kept colliding with basic reality. Food was expensive and wages had to be higher than planners expected. In that situation, factories that might have worked elsewhere collapsed. Skilled workers were scarce. Glass production remained weak, so wooden casks became a substitute and coopers were brought from across the border. In some crafts, however, local skill impressed even hardened military men. Russian officers admired the quality of blades forged in Tbilisi, and the empire tried to steal the secrets by sending master smiths to study under the city's best. Materials were imported, local iron was blended, and the steel was folded and worked with techniques that sounded almost like culinary metaphor, layer upon layer, until the metal held both sharpness and resilience. It was one of those moments when a conquered region quietly proved it had expertise the empire wanted. Then came the shock of 1832. A man known for stirring trouble visited his brother, a respected official, and revealed a plot to overthrow Russian rule. Motives were murky. He might have been recruiting. He might have been frightened, realizing that correspondence had been intercepted and hoping to save himself by betraying others first. His brother reacted with panic and moral blackmail, threatening self-harm unless the confession was made formally. Arrest orders were issued quickly, but the actual roundup dragged on for months, because conspiracies are easy to imagine and difficult to map. The Tsar, already haunted by earlier plots against his own power, demanded investigations and military trials. When the case was finally assembled, the conclusion was almost embarrassing. The conspirators were poorly organized, better at talking than acting, more dreamers than strategists. Officials described them as no real danger, yet scapegoats were still sought. Members of royal families were suspected from habit, even when they had no idea a coup had been discussed. In the capital cities of the empire, certain princes were already under suspicion for reading the wrong philosophers or complaining too openly about their lack of position. Others were watched because they travelled, asked questions, or attracted educated circles. The most dangerous royal exile, the prince who had spent decades as a symbol of resistance, was largely uninterested. Old age and hard experience had drained his appetite for romantic plans, and he dismissed the would-be plotters with weary indifference. There were also new currents shaping Georgian political imagination. Some conspirators had seen earlier Russian rebellions and learned lessons from them. Some had fought in imperial wars and returned with sharper ideas about organization, weapons, and mistakes to avoid. Polish exiles and veterans sent to the Caucasus after their own defeat added another layer. They arrived as soldiers, doctors, engineers, and administrators, and their presence accelerated development in practical ways even as it spread dangerous political stories in private rooms. One Georgian conspirator even travelled south seeking support from foreign powers, the kind of desperate diplomacy that appears whenever people believe a small nation can be freed by the rivalry of empires. The secret society operated like many frightened underground movements. Strict compartmentalization, limited contact, and an atmosphere where rumour replaces strategy. At first, some imagined a bloodless takeover and European sympathy. Later, as the empire hardened and as news from elsewhere turned darker, they shifted toward violence. They imagined aristocrats bringing armed retainers into the streets, disarming Russian detachments, and seizing officials at a banquet. Yet the mechanics were never fully worked out. Even the shape of the future state remained vague. The most common dream was a constitutional monarchy, a king constrained by ministers and an elected chamber, a hybrid of local tradition and European ideas. It was a political fantasy stitched together from the 19th century's most fashionable hopes. When verdicts came, harsh sentences were announced. Then, politics intervened. The empire needed Georgian cooperation against the jihad raging in the north. It also feared further damage to its reputation after bloodletting elsewhere. Executions were mostly commuted. Exile replaced hanging. Only a few individuals faced the heaviest punishments, including hard labour far away. Royal figures were scattered into provincial cities and placed under watch. Potential heirs and their families were handled cautiously, separated from one another, kept from crossing borders and absorbed into the safer world of St. Petersburg. The state's final gesture was calculated. Many conspirators were eventually pardoned and given posts in Tbilisi. It was a way to neutralize them by turning them into stakeholders. Rosen drew a clear lesson from the episode. Exclusion breeds plots. Inclusion, even limited, can turn enemies into administrators. Reform plans were drafted slowly and implemented even more slowly. The conspiracy became a turning point, not because it succeeded, but because it marked the end of a certain kind of hope. After that, the dream of restoring an old monarchy faded, and a new political generation began to prioritize social justice and modernization over crowns and ancient titles. With the capital temporarily calmer, Rosen turned his attention west. There, order was imposed through emergency methods, rather than deep reform. Military courts handled criminal cases. Old feuds and local tyrannies continued under a thin layer of imperial authority. Mingrelia was torn by family violence, and the governor had to force even basic acts like burial through threats. Local rulers dreamed of sudden wealth through timber and foreign trade, imagining new cities and grand names, but their territories remained fragile and internally divided. In Guria, instability followed the death of a regent, and children were removed and sent far away, leaving governance hollowed out. In Abkhazia, exiled princes returned under supervision, symbols of a frontier where loyalty could be bought and revoked. Even marriage became a political problem, with the administration trying for years to prevent scandals that might delegitimize authority or provoke wider unrest. By the late 1830s, Rosen's career collapsed suddenly, not primarily because of policy, but because of the Tsar's personal anger. During a royal tour, a carriage accident nearly killed the ruler, and symbols were erected to commemorate survival. Then, Rosen made a decision that looked normal by Georgian standards, and dangerous by imperial ones. He married his daughter into a powerful Western family. The son-in-law was soon exposed as abusive and corrupt. In a humiliating public scene, the Tsar stripped the man of rank and sent him away under escort. Rosen, who had protected him, was disgraced and reassigned. Soon after, illness struck him down. The message was clear. Personal rule had limits, and central authority would not tolerate local-style alliances that created independent power networks. After Rosen, the system shifted toward rigid centralization. Committees in St. Petersburg wanted the Caucasus treated like any other province. A new commander arrived with a blunt mandate: discipline, Russify, and prioritize war in the northern mountains above all else. Development continued in fragments. Schools, barracks, printing presses, irrigation works, and small improvements in certain towns. Yet infrastructure often collapsed faster than it could be rebuilt. Ports became useless when bridges failed. Workshops became military buildings. Refineries produced inferior goods. Observatories existed on paper without instruments, staff, or budgets. Roads swallowed money and still became impassable. Travellers described once famous stops as deserted or miserable. Russian settlement remained limited, and mixed families often found themselves rejected by both societies. In this era, prejudice also became policy. Anti-Jewish restrictions were enforced more aggressively, justified by complaints that Jewish peddling harmed peasants. Measures that sounded protective in official language functioned as exclusion in practice. At the same time, the administration could show unexpected flexibility on other cultural questions, choosing not to label certain Highland practices as pagan if baptism had been performed. Then came a new administrative overhaul. Large regions were fused into a single province under a commander-in-chief whose authority was fenced in by councils and bureaucratic layers. A city mayoralty was established with elected councillors, budgets, and taxes, a gesture toward civic life. Yet the influx of idle officials and the spread of petty corruption often strangled initiative and deepened frustration. The true crisis of this centralized period was the Gurian Rebellion of 1841. It began with villagers chasing off tax collectors, then escalated into armed bands demanding the end of cash taxes. Soldiers patrolled, but the revolt expanded until much of Guria was trying to push the military out. In one battle, a Russian column was forced back into a fortress. Weapons flowed from across the border and foreign consuls offered encouragement. For a moment, communication between Kutaisi and the sea was nearly cut. The uprising was eventually crushed by joint forces. Dozens died. Many were imprisoned and later pardoned. One leader was sent away to Siberia. The region was then reorganized as a military district, with locals turned into border guards in a model borrowed from Cossack practice. It was both punishment and incorporation, forcing service in exchange for survival. The commander who oversaw this period was replaced soon after, officially for illness. His successor ruled in relative stagnation. A census suggested that peace was finally producing demographic recovery, with births rising faster than deaths, though migration still drained people away. Small educational programs were launched, sending a handful of students to study languages needed for administration. Otherwise, the economy remained stubbornly limited. Akaltsike, cut off from old trade routes, did not become the engine some had imagined. Colonial sectarians caused new headaches, including extreme groups whose practices shocked even imperial authorities and were expelled or confined. Among German settlers, apocalyptic expectation spread again, and one charismatic elder tried to lead a mass pilgrimage on foot to Jerusalem. Cossacks blocked the movement, arrested ringleaders, and allowed only a few delegates. When those delegates returned, disappointed, most settlers drifted back toward more mainstream religious life. Tax revenue increased, but industry in Tbilisi remained narrow. Borders were surveyed professionally, but roads could not be built at the required scale because money, skills, and honest labour were lacking. A declared free port remained largely closed to foreign shipping in practice. The northern war against Shamil continued to bleed the empire. When failure became too obvious, the Tsar sought a different kind of ruler, a viceroy with both military weight and administrative imagination. Vorontsov arrived as a true viceroy, with authority concentrated in his hands and responsibility directed straight to the Tsar. His entrance into Tbilisi was met with real celebration because people were desperate for competence and tired of petty oppression. His household mattered politically as well. His wife took an active role, especially in education, and sometimes acted almost as a co-administrator. Reforms came quickly. Landowners were allowed to free serfs voluntarily. Students from Georgia gained wider access to imperial universities. The unwieldy administrative fusion was broken apart, giving regions clearer structures and granting Kutaisi a stronger institutional presence. Schools reached even remote mountain communities. Steamships were ordered to connect ports and make travel less dependent on broken roads. Newspapers became more readable and public libraries appeared, signs of a civic culture the empire wanted to display. Not every change was liberal. Catholic missionaries, who had often served as the only doctors in many places, were expelled, and proselytizing among Orthodox Christians was forbidden. Some clergy chose exile abroad, founding institutions that became centers for diaspora life. Vorontsov's effort to exalt orthodoxy sometimes produced ugly consequences. A massive church bell was cast and dragged across the frozen river by soldiers in a public spectacle meant to glorify faith and empire. During the operation, a Jewish soldier was crushed to death, a moment that captured the dark side of the period. Public religion mixed with prejudice and disregard for the bodies that made such displays possible. Vorontsov's most effective strategy was integration through local elites and languages. He was accused of favouring locals over Russians, and he did not always deny it. High-born Georgians were rehabilitated into high office. Provincial governorships and senior military posts were given to men with local roots. This helped legitimacy and improved communication. Imperial schooling in the region required Russian boys to learn a local language, an unusual policy that acknowledged reality rather than pretending it away. Scholars were commissioned to gather manuscripts, translate chronicles, and travel the countryside recording monuments and traditions. Those journeys mattered because many old structures were already collapsing, and without records they would vanish from memory. Vorontsov still drew limits, arguing that the country was not ready for a university. But he expanded education steadily. Muslim communities gained schools. Seminaries emphasized practical skills like medicine and agriculture more than classical languages alone. The goal was not simply literacy, but a workforce capable of supporting an imperial province. Vorontsov's economic program never followed a single, tidy plan. It looked more like a series of experiments, driven by curiosity, connections, and a belief that the Caucasus could be pushed into modern production if the right seeds, animals, and machines were simply brought in. Tbilisi gained a match factory that actually worked and turned a steady profit, while more unusual goods entered the supply chain. Large quantities of leeches, still considered indispensable in military medicine, were purchased through a foreign dealer operating along the western coast and shipped out for use in army hospitals. New varieties of tobacco and cottonseed arrived from across the Atlantic. Tea seed was ordered from East Asia. Hard-working donkeys from the Mediterranean were imported in the hope of breeding stronger pack animals for mountain transport. Citrus saplings came from the northern shore of the Black Sea, where they had already been tried with some success. Russian beekeepers were encouraged to settle, Spanish sheep were brought in to improve wool, and vines were introduced from estates far from Kakheti. The results were mixed, sometimes absurdly so. Some seeds never took root. Some animals died quickly in the heat. The imported vines carried disease that later damaged local vineyards. Yet a few initiatives quietly paid off. German settlers near Gori grew tobacco that proved well suited to the local soil and climate. Tea, at first a fragile experiment, was planted deliberately in Guria in the late 1840s. And though it began as an uncertain garden project, it eventually turned into something far larger. Decades later, Georgian tea would be celebrated abroad and become a serious cash crop. Not because it was destined from the beginning, but because someone had insisted on trying it early and kept the idea alive long enough for conditions to change. Forests were treated as both a temptation and a national reserve. Valuable oak and walnut drew attention from merchants and opportunists. But large-scale export of such timber was blocked, protecting Guria from the kind of rapid stripping that frontier economies often suffer. Vorontsov also pushed against a habit common in occupying armies, using soldiers as cheap labour for civilian projects. By limiting that practice, urban craftsmen and guilds benefited, and the city's workshops gained room to grow. By mid-century, Tbilisi had heavy industry by regional standards, including an artillery foundry and metalworks, managed by German specialists. Outside the capital, market life was strengthened. Gori hosted regular farmers' markets. Signagi developed an annual fair. In 1850, the capital staged an agricultural exhibition, not merely as entertainment, but as propaganda for modernization. Through British contacts and international showcases, selected Georgian products were displayed abroad and even won medals, giving the administration a way to claim that the province was not only pacified, but progressing. For Vorontsov, however, the greatest weakness was not agriculture or factories. It was movement. Across Transcaucasia, transport was the permanent headache. Bridges vanished in spring floods. River crossings became dangerous bottlenecks. Money was poured into roads that still failed. Engineers built and rebuilt only to watch stonework crumble. One celebrated bridge at Gori, constructed by a foreign specialist, survived barely a season. Yet in Tbilisi, a major bridge linking the city's halves endured, becoming one of the few symbols of infrastructure that outlasted its political moment. the main military highway remained a running joke among locals, who said the state might as well have laid down the currency spent on it as paving stones. Progress came less from roads than from water. Shallow draft steamers could navigate the Kura from the Caspian and the Rioni from the Black Sea, at least in theory, as long as sandbanks and driftwood were managed. Coal mining in Racha was expanded in anticipation of a future transport system powered by steam, and outside consultants were brought in to explore routes that could connect Western Georgia to Europe via river and sea corridors. Customs revenue began to rise as steamships unloaded more regularly at the coast. A small prosperity appeared, fragile but visible. Yet even this carried an unexpected consequence. Cash in motion attracted violence. Coaches transporting government funds became targets for robbery, and corruption inside the army fed insecurity from another direction, with soldiers caught selling weapons and munitions into the mountains. Discipline was enforced through harsh military justice, and courts martial were used not only against bandits, but against officials and soldiers, whose theft threatened the entire system. Pacification in the West was handled with the same blend of bargaining and force. Border disputes between Abkhazia and Mingrelius were settled by taking contested land out of local hands and placing it under direct military oversight, while compensating a leading prince with a large payment to mute resistance. In Mingrelia, the death of rulers created openings for the centre to tighten control. Regency arrangements were used to reduce autonomy, placing power in the hands of figures who were socially tied to the imperial world rather than to local dynastic networks. By the 1850s, the ruling family in Zugdidi lived in conspicuous European style, with a court that spoke Russian and dined like St. Petersburg, while a small elite extracted wealth from a much larger peasantry. Guria, too, was folded more tightly into the Western administrative system, and even when local men were once considered suitable border guards, that role was withdrawn and redefined. Abkhazia remained an awkward compromise, its ruler tolerated despite dealings that the empire publicly condemned, including connections across the Ottoman frontier and the continued shadow economy of slavery. Svanetchia, remote and violent, was treated almost as a separate world, with blood feuds and clan warfare continuing beyond the reach of normal law. Vorontsov's success changed how the throne viewed him. His liberal instincts, once suspect, became acceptable as long as they delivered results. When the heir toured the Caucasus in 1850, the atmosphere contrasted sharply with earlier royal visits, marked by scandal and humiliation. The viceroy's court was staged as a smaller version of the imperial capital, complete with banquets, salons, and social rituals designed to bind the Georgian nobility to the system. A definitive register of noble status was compiled and fraudulent claims rejected in large numbers, not only to impose order but to control privilege. Even emancipation of serfs, when it occurred, was required to pass through documentation, limiting impulsive acts that could destabilize property relations. Culture became a tool of governance. A theatre was established in Tbilisi and made into a showcase of European taste. Opera singers and ballet dancers were brought in, and a repertory tradition was launched with famous performers. The point was not only entertainment, it was to create a public sphere that felt modern and imperial, and to distract ambitious minds from conspiratorial politics. At the same time, Georgian language drama was allowed room to breathe, mostly in harmless comedy, yet it still mattered because it created writers, audiences, and a sense that local culture could exist within the new order. A leading Georgian playwright, once involved in earlier dissent, became a central figure in the city's cultural life, moving between bureaucracy, journalism, and the stage. A literary journal appeared as an outlet for fiction and prose. The theatre and the press helped deliver a new type of Georgian public figure, educated, urban, and capable of shaping opinion. Vorontsov himself cultivated an image that mixed soldier and gentleman. In the mountains, he pursued Shamil across dangerous passes and narrowly survived disasters that cost thousands of lives. After such bloodshed, he could swing toward pragmatism, arguing that endless fighting was not worth the cost, and that negotiation might achieve what campaigns could not. In the city, he played the role of a grand host, a man of appetites and charm, surrounded by rumours of romantic attachments and court intrigue. He managed scandals with the cold efficiency of someone who understood rank and discipline. Inconvenient lovers were sent to the front, and society was expected to pretend nothing had happened. Even opponents respected him, and he maintained working relationships across ethnic and religious divides, including with senior Armenian church leaders. That cultivated European reputation came under threat when Georgia experienced its first major blood libel panic. A dead child was found near Surami, and Jews were accused of ritual murder. Houses were attacked, and local power figures attempted to manufacture proof to satisfy public fury. Jewish representatives travelled to Tbilisi to appeal directly to authority. A trial followed, and the accused were acquitted. Abroad, influential Jewish leaders received polite assurances that such medieval accusations could not survive in a properly governed province. Yet the story did not end cleanly. Appeals and bureaucratic manoeuvring kept suspicion alive, and years later the higher courts still treated several of the acquitted men as permanently suspect, imposing exile and surveillance. In the background, prejudice persisted, and certain resorts and public spaces were quietly restricted to everyone except Jews, a reminder that modernization did not automatically mean equal rights. The Tsar intervened only once in a way that became public gossip. A large brawl erupted in a market, kiosks were destroyed, and a man was killed by a thrown brick. The ruler heard exaggerated reports of multiple deaths and demanded an explanation. The viceroy responded bluntly that mass brawling had long been treated as a kind of urban sport and had been tolerated by earlier regimes. The solution imposed from above was almost comic. Fighting could continue, but only outside town, under police supervision and without weapons. It was an attempt to regulate violence rather than eliminate it. By the end of 1853, Vorontsov's health declined, and the broader geopolitical situation darkened. War with the Ottoman Empire escalated into a larger European conflict that threatened the entire structure Russia had built in the Caucasus. Vorontsov resigned, leaving behind instructions and unfinished projects. His replacement lacked imagination and confidence. The war cut the province off from its ports, disrupted supplies, and turned development into emergency management. Essential goods ran scarce. Road building was abandoned on key passes, and broken routes were patched rather than rebuilt. Foreign entrepreneurs continued to operate under suspicion. Highland communities were treated as security risks and were prevented from purchasing grain in case supplies reached Shamil's fighters, now aligned with Russia's enemies. Economic hardship sparked flight and panic. Villages that depended on passing trade lost income when travel collapsed. Shortages of salt and grain pushed communities toward desperation. Some settlements emptied as residents fled rather than starve. Authorities treated flight as rebellion, further poisoning relations. In western Georgia, suspicion spread like a second epidemic. Catholic clergy were branded as foreign agents. Polish exiles were watched. Even an American businessman could be described as a conspirator simply because foreigners were convenient targets in wartime. Reed's reputation was destroyed when raiders from Dagestan struck Kakhetiya, killing many and taking hundreds of captives, including prominent aristocratic women, children, and a foreign governess. The hostages were delivered to Shamil, and the imperial court was forced into a humiliating exchange to secure their release. Compensation was paid to noble families, but the psychological damage was greater. It exposed how fragile security remained, despite decades of pacification. A new viceroy arrived in 1855 with a reputation for harshness. Almost immediately he reversed as many of Vorontsov's civic initiatives as possible. The theatre was closed, justified by the death of the Tsar and the needs of war, but the gesture was read locally as contempt. Plans were made to dismiss professional musicians and reduce culture to military bands. Georgian plays were dismissed as morally suspect. Economic experiments were shut down, and institutions that required long-term investment were criticized as unprofitable. The Armenian Patriarch was treated as a hostile agent for receiving correspondence from abroad. Georgians were pushed out of administrative roles. Petitioners were treated as nuisances, and women's petitions were often ignored unless they fit narrow categories that the bureaucracy considered acceptable. Education suffered badly. Schools were converted into hospitals or burned during wartime chaos. Graduation rates collapsed. Instead of expanding training, the administration emphasized rote memorization of prayers and strict uniforms, as if discipline could replace learning. The viceroy's personal behavior scandalized locals and reinforced the sense of humiliation. Yet, despite these failures, the crisis of war forced attention back to military realities. Ottoman forces attacked from multiple directions, threatening Akhaltsikhe and the valley routes toward Tbilisi, pushing into coastal zones and enabling movement up the rivers toward the interior. Shamil's fighters kept pressure on Kakhetiya from the northeast. Local militias played a major role in holding key positions, while some regional leaders were suspected of playing both sides, promising loyalty until foreign armies actually landed. Western Georgia suffered heavily during the conflict with the Ottoman Empire, as towns were destroyed, estates burned, and local elites weakened. Although Russia captured key positions like Kars, peace settlements reshaped regional control rather than ending tensions. After 1855, Russian rule in the Caucasus intensified under a new administration that combined military force with reform. The defeat of resistance leader Shamil in 1859 allowed the empire to focus on governance, introducing administrative reorganization, economic development, education, and infrastructure. However, corruption, social inequality, and delayed reforms, especially the slow abolition of serfdom, created unrest among peasants and nobles alike. Local revolts in regions such as Mingrelia and Svanetia led to the removal of traditional rulers and the gradual elimination of regional autonomy. Russian authority expanded through direct control, forced population movements, and suppression of resistance, particularly in Abkhazia and the northwest Caucasus. Mass deportations, land redistribution, and military administration reshaped the demographic structure of the region. At the same time, modernization advanced unevenly. Cities grew, trade expanded, railways connected major regions, and industry developed around oil, agriculture, and manufacturing. A new educated class emerged, fostering cultural revival, print culture, and national awareness. Yet reforms often remained limited. Legal and political rights were restricted, and Russification policies sought to weaken local identities by imposing Russian language and administration. By the late 19th century, social and political tensions intensified. Georgian intellectuals promoted cultural renewal and political reform, while workers organized through socialist movements shaped by industrialization. Minority communities also experienced major change, including urban migration and rising political awareness, but continued to face discrimination. Increasing centralization under Alexander III brought harsher control, cultural repression, and growing resistance. By the early 20th century, the Caucasus had become a region of strikes, uprisings, and political mobilization, entering a new era marked by modernization, stronger national consciousness, and deep conflict between imperial authority and local aspirations.